It began in a blizzard, in a world of white and silence. The forest was still, the roads frozen, and the sky hung low with heavy snow that blurred the horizon into ghostly haze. It was December 1944. Deep in the Ardennes, and for the weary American soldiers holding the northern sector of the front, it felt like the quiet before the end. The war, they believed, was nearly over. The German army was beaten, its cities burning, its people starving. But then, out of that silence, came the rumble. Distant at first, then growing, like thunder crawling over the hills. And through the mist came tanks, Panthers and Tigers, their engines growling, their tracks crushing the frozen earth. The snow erupted in fire. The Battle of the Bulge had begun, and at its northern tip, on a long ridge of ice and mud, a handful of American divisions would stand firm, against the full weight of Hitler's last great offensive. This is the entire history of the Battle of Elsenborn Ridge, where the Bulge broke, where courage held the line, and where the fate of the Western Front was decided. The story of Elsenborn Ridge began not with glory, but with surprise. On December 16, 1944, three German armies, the 6th SS Panzer Army, the 5th Panzer Army, and the 7th Army, launched a massive counterattack through the Ardennes. Hitler's plan was audacious: drive through Belgium, seize Antwerp, and split the Allied forces in two. To achieve it, he gathered what remained of Germany's strength: 200,000 men, 1,000 tanks, and the last reserves of fuel and ammunition left in the Reich. The northern prong of the offensive, commanded by SS General Sepp Dietrich, was the most powerful of all. His Spearhead, the 1st SS Panzer Corps, was led by veteran units like the Leibstandarte, Adolf Hitler, and Hitler-Jugend divisions. Their objective was simple: smash through the thin American lines near Monschau and Elsenborn, capture key roads, and open the path for the Panzers to sweep toward Liège. But between them and victory stood the soldiers of the U.S. First Army, the 99th Infantry Division, the 2nd Infantry Division, and elements of the 91st Field Artillery Battalion. Young, under-equipped, and frozen to the bone, they were about to face the storm. In the pre-dawn darkness, the German artillery opened fire. Thousands of shells screamed through the snow, shattering trees, ripping through foxholes, and lighting up the sky in an infernal glow. The bombardment was the signal. The attack had begun. Waves of German infantry, supported by tanks, poured through the forests toward the American positions. They came through the Lossheimer Gap, through Billingen, and along narrow roads choked with snow and smoke. The Americans, many of them green replacements barely out of training, were caught in a nightmare. Communication lines snapped, radios failed, and entire companies were cut off. Yet even in the chaos, they fought back. The 99th Division, making its combat debut, held fast against veterans of the Waffen-SS. Their officers barked orders through the snow, their machine guns raked the trees, and their artillery answered with deadly precision. To the south, the 2nd Infantry Division, already hardened by years of combat, counterattacked fiercely. They pulled back to the Elsenborn Ridge, a long, sloping rise of ground that overlooked the key road network leading west. It was the perfect defensive position, and they meant to hold it at all costs. Artillery units set up their guns in mud and ice, firing until their barrels glowed red. Engineers dug trenches in the frozen soil. Infantrymen braced for the coming storm. When the Germans attacked again, in waves day after day, they met a wall of fire. The battle for Elsenborn Ridge became one of attrition. For nearly 2 weeks, German tanks and infantry launched relentless assaults, trying to break through the ridge and seize the roads to Malmedy and Liège. The Americans answered with coordinated artillery barrages that tore the attacks apart before they could reach the line. The ridge became a cauldron of smoke, snow, and shattered metal. Every attack ended the same way, with burning tanks and bodies left in the snow. The Germans called it the Death Factory. What made Elsenborn different from so many other battles was not just the bravery of its defenders, but the precision of its artillery. The American gunners, men of the 91st Field Artillery Battalion and others, were masters of their craft. Using forward observers hidden in the trees and radar-directed fire, they unleashed destruction with uncanny accuracy. In the blizzards and fog where the infantry could barely see, the artillery became their eyes and their salvation. German columns moving through the woods were cut to pieces. Tanks were trapped in the narrow valleys, their paths blocked by wreckage. The SS divisions designed for rapid offense found themselves grinding to a halt in front of an enemy that refused to bend. By December 24th, the northern flank of the Bulge was broken. The German advance had stalled completely at Elsenborn Ridge. Dietrich's SS Panzer units were spent, their fuel gone, their morale shattered. Hitler's dream of reaching Antwerp was over before Christmas. The stand at Elsenborn had held the line, forcing the entire German offensive to squeeze southward into the narrow corridor toward Bastogne. There the fight would continue, but the battle's outcome had already been decided. The ridge had stopped the Reich's last great gamble. The cost, however, was brutal. The snow hid the bodies of thousands. Entire units were nearly destroyed. Men froze where they lay. The trees were stripped bare by shrapnel. The air stank of cordite and smoke. Survivors spoke of the cold as a living enemy, the kind that crawled into their bones and stayed there for decades. For the Germans it was worse. The SS formations that had once marched with pride were reduced to scattered survivors trudging back through the snow, their tanks abandoned, their hopes gone. Elsenborn Ridge became a symbol, not just of victory, but of endurance. It was where ordinary soldiers, freezing, exhausted, and outnumbered, proved that discipline and courage could hold against the fiercest assault of the war. It was the moment when the German war machine, once unstoppable, met an army that would not yield. The line had held, and in that act, the course of the Western Front was sealed. Today the ridge still overlooks the rolling forests of Belgium. The scars remain, shell craters softened by moss, rusted helmets buried beneath the leaves, and memorials that mark where men stood and died in the snow. The wind still howls across the frozen ground, carrying the memory of that bitter winter when the fate of Europe hung by a thread. The Battle of Elsenborn Ridge was not the most famous fight of the war, but it was one of the most decisive. It was where the Bulge broke, where Hitler's last dream froze solid in the snows of Belgium. It was the stand that made all others possible. Tonight we return to that frozen battlefield, to the echo of shells in the night, to the flash of guns lighting the fog, and to the quiet courage of those who refuse to retreat. This is the entire history of the Battle of Elsenborn Ridge, the line that held, the ridge that broke the Bulge, and the men who turned winter itself into a weapon. Before we begin, tell me, where in the world are you tuning in from? And what time is it for you tonight? Are you somewhere warm, far from the biting cold of the Ardennes, or do you feel the chill of that winter wind as history unfolds once more? Wherever you are, take a deep breath, settle in, and let me know. I'd love to hear where in time and place you're joining us from tonight. December 16th, 2024, Bütgenbach, Belgium. The air hangs brittle and colourless above the Elsenborn Ridge as the wind drags snow across the old artillery pits, still visible beneath frost. A metal sign marks the position once held by Company E, 393rd Infantry Regiment, 99th Division. The ground rises gently to 600 meters above sea level, a modest height that once commanded every road between Monchaux, Malmedy, and Liège. Beneath the snow lie rusted shell casings stamped Fort Howard 1944, and fragments of ration tins, mute evidence of men who endured weeks of fire and cold. The ridge itself is unremarkable to the eye, no jagged cliffs or towering heights, yet its elevation provided a perfect field of fire over the Losheimer Graben Valley to the east. Each step crunches through a layer of frozen soil, where 80 years earlier the thunder of artillery never ceased. Today the silence feels absolute. It hides a story of endurance that turned an obscure Belgian hill into the hinge of Hitler's last gamble. On December 11th, 1944, engineers from the 99th Infantry Divisions, 393rd Regiment, began cutting shallow fighting positions along a front roughly 8 kilometers wide. The ridge's slope, only 4 degrees on its eastern face, was deceptive. It offered both concealment and command. Surveys by V Corps engineers recorded the soil depth at 70 centimeters before hitting shale, enough for only partial foxholes. Field Manual FM 5-15 advised using timber revetments to reinforce such positions, but supplies were scarce, and men substituted doors torn from nearby barns. Artillery units of the 2nd Infantry Division positioned 105mm howitzers from the 420th Field Artillery Battalion behind the crest, covering an arc from Billingen to Würzfeld. This layout meant that for every kilometer of frontage, American gunners could mass over 30 tubes, 3 times the density typical of earlier campaigns in France. The numbers seemed excessive for a quiet sector, yet they would soon prove prophetic. To the west, planners in the 1st U.S. Army believed the Ardennes offered natural security, dense forests, poor roads, and the thin American line appeared a logical rest zone before the next advance into Germany. In contrast, across the border in the Eifel, General Sepp Dietrich's 6th SS Panzer Army interpreted the same terrain differently. German topographical studies, designated Kartenstelle Eifel Nr. 2744, emphasized the low ground between Hofen and Losheimer Graben as an ideal axis of advance toward Liège. What Allied cartographers saw as protection, the Wehrmacht saw as opportunity. The ridge, sitting astride the N68 highway, was the single obstacle on the northern shoulder. Both sides possessed the same maps, but they read destiny in opposite directions. The Americans built a rest area. The Germans planned an invasion route. Between these interpretations lay the fate of the Ardennes. In early December, reconnaissance flights by the 9th Air Force photographed no German concentrations east of the Schnee Eifel. Analysts logged routine vehicle traffic on December 12th, failing to notice the concealed movement of the 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler. When the offensive began at 5:30 a.m. on December 16th, American forward observers of the 99th Division recorded shell impacts every 5 seconds for 20 minutes straight. Their log, entry number 412, noted estimated 150 to 200 guns opposite sector. This density of fire, roughly 3 batteries per kilometer, exceeded even the bombardment preceding Operation Market Garden. Yet when the smoke cleared, most American guns remained operational, protected by defilade behind the ridge's crest. The engineers' hasty sighting, done without expectation of combat, had unintentionally created a near-perfect defensive geometry. That geometry mattered more than any order or speech. The ridge's top permitted observation of every road feeding into the Losheimer Graben, while the shallow valleys forced attackers into narrow corridors. For artillery, this meant that a single forward observer with a field telephone could coordinate overlapping barrages from multiple battalions. Lieutenant Walter A. Herder, Fire Direction Center, 2nd Division Artillery, later recalled in his January 5, 1945 report that the terrain itself provided range brackets without calibration. German gunners positioned in forest depressions lacked similar visibility. Their shells often fell short or overshot entirely. Thus, the same snow and fog that blinded the attackers served as a curtain for defenders whose maps and elevation lines told them exactly where to aim. Comparisons with the southern front are stark. Around Bastogne, where open fields prevailed, artillery required aerial spotting and constant ammunition resupply. At Elsenborn, the opposite occurred. Static defense enabled sustained precision fire after action analysis estimated that each battery consumed only 70% of its daily allowance, despite firing continuously, owing to efficient registration. German logs captured after the battle, specifically the 12th SS Panzer Division's Tagesbefehl vom 18. December recorded frustration at enemy fires arriving simultaneously on all points. That simultaneity was no accident. It resulted from the American time-on-target system, perfected through mathematics and radio synchronization. Technology met topography, and the ridge amplified both. The men living on that ridge paid for every advantage in exhaustion. Temperatures averaged -17 degrees Celsius, and wind speeds reached 30 kilometers per hour. Sergeant James L. McConnell of Company I described in his diary how canteens froze solid by midday, and rifles required warming undercoats to function. Yet, despite frozen mechanisms and numb hands, the 99th Division maintained continuous watch. They knew little of the scale of the assault forming before them. Orders from V Corps labeled their position a secondary defense zone. In practice, it became the front line of Europe's final great land battle. The soldiers sensed it before their superiors did. By nightfall on December 16th, the Elsenborn Ridge had transformed from a map coordinate into a fortress. 300 artillery pieces, their barrels lined with frost, stood ready across its 12-kilometer length. Communications buzzed through field wire laid hastily across snow, connecting observation posts, mortar platoons and headquarters at Bütgenbach. Reports filtered in of armor advancing through the forest east of Krinkelt, yet the ridge held silent, waiting. What neither the men nor their commanders yet understood was that this unassuming rise of ground, 600 meters of frozen Belgian soil, would become the point where the German dream of splitting the Allied front shattered. The snow muffled the world into stillness. Beneath that stillness, history was assembling its anvil. The hammer would fall with dawn. October the 5th, 1944, Adlerhorst headquarters, Ziegenberg, Germany. Inside the dimly lit war room, Adolf Hitler stood before a wall-sized map of Western Europe, his right hand trembling slightly as he pointed toward Antwerp with a silver-tipped baton. He declared that the Allies would be split in two by a single, decisive stroke. The plan, codenamed Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, was presented as a grand counteroffensive designed to replicate the miracle of 1940. Yet beneath the theatrical confidence, the numbers told a different story. The Oberkommando der Wehrmacht estimated that the 6th SS Panzer Army under Sepp Dietrich and the 5th Panzer Army under Hasso von Manteuffel would require 5 million gallons of fuel to reach Antwerp, but their supply depots held barely half that amount. Still, Hitler insisted the offensive would succeed through faith, will, and weather. The plan was not merely ambitious, it was detached from reality. and that detachment would soon define every decision to come. The plan's foundation rested on a single flawed assumption, that the Ardennes, a region Hitler believed the Americans considered a quiet sector, was still undefended. According to OKW Operations Directive No. 10A, issued on November 11, 1944, the strike would be concentrated along an 85-kilometer front between Monschau and Echternach. The goal was to pierce through the northern shoulder, seize crossings over the Meuse River within 72 hours, and capture Antwerp within 5 days. The terrain analysis, however, was cursory and outdated, relying on maps from 1940. Field reconnaissance teams from Army Group B reported poor road networks, steep gradients, and dense forests unsuited to mechanized movement, but their findings were buried under layers of optimism. By treating geography as a matter of willpower rather than logistics, Wacht and Rhein was already built on unstable ground. In stark contrast, the Allies viewed the same geography with entirely different eyes. American engineers from the 90th Engineer Battalion had surveyed the Ardennes throughout the autumn and classified it as tank-restrictive terrain, noting road widths averaging only 3 meters and soil compositions prone to freezing. Where German staff officers saw a path to Antwerp, Allied planners saw a defensive bottleneck. The U.S. Army had placed inexperienced troops, the 99th Infantry Division, along the Elsenborn Ridge precisely because it seemed unlikely the Germans would attack there. That irony, born of differing assumptions, would soon determine the fate of the offensive. The same woods that Hitler saw as concealment, the Americans saw as protection. Each side was reading the same map, but only one was reading the landscape. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commanding OB West, expressed open skepticism during the initial briefing. His private notes from October 22nd described the plan as eine Fantasie, nicht ein Feldzug, a fantasy, not a campaign. General Walter Model, the Führer's fireman, echoed that concern in his diary, warning that fuel shortages would cripple even a successful breakthrough. Despite these warnings, Hitler pressed forward, claiming that the Allied front was a hollow shell. Preparations began in earnest by late November, with the 6th SS Panzer Army assembling near Euskirchen, roughly 80 kilometers from the front. Over 2,000 armored vehicles, including 400 Panther tanks and 150 Tigers, were dispersed across the Eifel region under strict radio silence. For all its secrecy, the operation relied on an illusion that surprise could compensate for physics. Technically, the logistics of Wacht and Rhein bordered on the impossible. The German Quartermaster General's staff calculated that advancing divisions would consume 60,000 gallons of fuel per day, yet resupply depended on horse-drawn wagons for the first 40 kilometers. In contrast, American supply doctrine emphasized motorized transport, with quartermaster truck companies maintaining 2-day fuel reserves within 20 kilometers of the front. The German reliance on captured Allied fuel stocks was not a contingency, it was the plan. Every Tiger and Panther was issued a special siphon kit to drain abandoned vehicles, a desperate measure masquerading as preparation. Even before a single gun fired, the offensive's success hinged on what the enemy might leave behind. By December 1, 1944, the intelligence picture had turned deceptive. German analysts at Fremde Heer West, Foreign Armies West, assured the High Command that American morale was collapsing after the Hürtgen Forest campaign. A captured issue of Stars and Stripes describing exhausted GIs was circulated as proof. Yet ultra-decrypts on the Allied side revealed the opposite supply throughput via the Red Ball Express had increased by 20% in November, and reinforcements from the US 9th Army were arriving near Aachen. Inside Adlerhorst, these realities were ignored. The plan thrived not on data, but on faith. "The enemy will not expect us," Hitler told his generals. He was right, but not in the way he imagined. The human consequences of these misjudgments were enormous. Every German soldier in the attacking force, over 200,000 men, was told they were part of a last war-winning stroke. They trained under freezing rain in the Eifel Hills, their vehicles camouflaged beneath fir branches, their rations limited to 3 days' worth of bread and ersatz coffee. Many officers privately admitted the plan felt like a ghost operation, its promises fading with every cold dawn. Manteuffel, commanding the 5th Panzer Army, later confessed that "we all knew this was not strategy but theatre." The offensive was already haunted by its own illusions. In the end, Wacht am Rhein was less a campaign plan than a manifestation of Hitler's psychological war against reality. It sought to reverse defeat, not through numbers or terrain, but through surprise and sheer audacity. Yet that audacity ignored the one element that would define the battle, the high ground at Elsenborn Ridge. What appeared to be a minor plateau on an old map would soon decide the fate of the entire northern assault. As December approached, the German war machine moved into position, engines idling in the cold. The Ardennes was silent, the storm was gathering, and the ridge, still forgotten, was waiting. December 15th, 1944. Krinkelt, Rocherath sector, Belgium. The men of the 99th Infantry Division, fresh from training grounds in Camp Van Dorn, Mississippi, were scattered among snow-dusted foxholes on the northern edge of the Ardennes. Private First Class Ralph J. Riley of Company E, 393rd Regiment, scribbled a note home describing nothing but quiet woods, frost, and boredom. Most of the men were under 22 years old, college students and factory hands turned riflemen. Their rifles, M1 Garands, leaned against logs crusted with ice, and field telephones crackled faintly under layers of burlap. The division had only 9,000 combat-effective men spread along a 21-mile front, one soldier for every 12 yards of snow. No one expected contact here. Their orders were simple: hold the line, observe, and wait for rotation out. But the stillness of that evening was not peace. It was the inhale before history exhaled fire. At 0300 hours on December 16th, forward patrols near Lanzerath reported faint mechanical noises from the east, a rhythmic growl like 1,000 stoves burning. Those sounds were the engines of Kampfgruppe Peiper, part of the 6th SS Panzer Army, massing less than 5 miles away. German formations were stacked at a density of 18 battalions per 5 miles of frontage, an assault concentration unmatched since Kursk. The 99th's intelligence section logged the report but lacked confirmation equipment. Their SCR-300 radios had limited range in the hilly terrain. 4 hours passed before V Corps headquarters received the message. By then, the first artillery shells had already landed. The system designed for coordination became a delay machine. In war, communication time was survival time, and the 99th's clock was already running out. The Americans were outnumbered, but the Germans were overconfident. German planners believed the 99th to be a green unit, poorly trained, low in morale, and incapable of cohesive defense. That assessment was based on captured field manuals describing U.S. defensive depth doctrine as slow and inflexible. In reality, the 99th's commanders, like Colonel Alexander O. Smith, had drilled their troops in rapid-fire maneuver tactics, emphasizing small unit autonomy. The result was a thin line that could bend without breaking. German formations, by contrast, relied on rigid regimental timing and heavy coordination. Once fog and snow disrupted those timetables, precision became paralysis. The 99th's weakness, its thinness, would become its strength. Each platoon fought as an island, but together they formed a reef that stopped a tide. In the village of Rocherath, Sergeant Donald E. Rudisill's bazooka team crouched behind a stone wall at dawn, their breath freezing in white plumes. Through the fog, a shadow moved, a Panther tank from the 1st SS Panzer Regiment, its 80mm gun glinting faintly. The men waited until it rolled within 50 yards. Rudisill fired, striking the thinner side armor just behind the turret ring. The explosion split the silence, and the tank lurched, black smoke curling from the hatches. That single kill delayed the German column for 30 minutes, long enough for the US artillery at Würzfeld to plot firing coordinates. Rudisill's after-action report described the engagement with dry understatement. Target destroyed, crew evacuated in confusion. In reality, that one bazooka team had changed the timing of an entire army's advance. As the morning unfolded, the battlefield dissolved into chaos. Snow-blinded observation posts, telephone lines snapped under artillery bursts, and map coordinates lost meaning as landmarks vanished beneath smoke. Command posts in Krinkelt received overlapping reports: armor near Büllingen, infantry near Hofen, paratroopers rumored in the woods. Captain Robert M. Cubberson of the 394th Regiment wrote in his log, "Every company believes it's the main target." The Germans' strength of surprise became their weakness of dispersion. Instead of a clean breakthrough, the offensive splintered into dozens of local fights. For the 99th, survival depended on initiative, not orders. Each man's decision now carried the weight of a nation's defense. Field reports captured the surreal imbalance of forces. The 99th faced 18 battalions of German infantry, supported by more than 150 tanks, while their own anti-tank company fielded just 16 M1 57mm guns. The division's artillery, the 373rd Field Artillery Battalion, fired over 6,000 rounds that day, averaging one shell every 3 seconds across their batteries. Despite the intensity, ammunition resupply lagged by half a day. The enemy's superiority in armor and numbers should have been decisive, but terrain and training negated it. The Elsenborn Ridge forced the Germans into narrow corridors, where every tank became a target funneling toward pre-sighted kill zones. Geography, not manpower, leveled the fight. Letters recovered from the front later revealed the human dimension beneath the statistics. In one note, dated December 17th, Private Riley wrote to his brother, "We're catching hell here, but the fellas are steady. You can't dig fear out of frozen ground." The cold was an enemy of its own. -10°C at night. Boots frozen stiff by dawn. Medics treated frostbite with morphine because the painkillers ran out before the bandages did. Yet morale held. Each man understood, perhaps dimly, that the longer they stood, the longer the Germans would burn fuel they could not replace. They were fighting time as much as tanks. December 17th, 1944. Observation post atop Elsenborn Ridge, near Bütgenbach, Belgium. The pre-dawn darkness was pierced by the first German artillery rounds, 75mm shells, streaking across the frozen forest like fiery needles. Forward observer Lieutenant Charles H. Henderson of the 273rd Field Artillery Battalion gripped his binoculars, scanning snow-choked tree lines while calculating range corrections on a clipboard smeared with frost. The horizon glowed intermittently as flares from Krinkelt illuminated armored columns moving silently toward Dom Bütgenbach. Civilians, caught in the crossfire, fled into the nearby woods, their footsteps swallowed by snow and echoing artillery fire. 30 meters away, a portable SCR-284 radio crackled with fragmented reports from batteries already engaging targets. The ridge, 600 meters high, and sharply sloped toward the east, allowed observers to triangulate firing coordinates with near-perfect accuracy. By sunrise, the Americans were ready to convert snow into steel. 25 artillery battalions, including the 273rd, 373rd, and 420th Field Artillery Battalions, fired in coordinated salvos using map grid overlays. Each battery was assigned sectors based on pre-registered coordinates that accounted for elevation, wind speed, and powder temperature. A single forward observer could direct fire for multiple battalions, calculating time-on-target sequences to deliver simultaneous impacts. This method allowed over 10,000 rounds of 155mm shells to be fired in a single day with minimal overlap or wasted ammunition. Compared to German artillery practice, which relied on pre-surveyed positions and visual spotting, the US system allowed flexibility and responsiveness. Every correction communicated by phone or radio translated immediately into a salvo that could shred advancing infantry or halt a Panther column. The technical precision turned the ridge into a trap that funneled attackers into concentrated kill zones. The German assault unfolded at Bütgenbach, where the 12th SS Panzer Division attempted a frontal breakthrough. Panther tanks, each weighing 45 tons and mounting 80mm high-velocity guns, advanced through snow-laden fields, expecting to overrun light defenses. In contrast, US artillery observers combined topography and timing to pre-register impact zones along likely approach paths. Each tank lane was covered by overlapping barrages, forcing vehicles into narrow corridors where bazooka teams and anti-tank guns waited. German officers later recorded in Tagesbefehl NR19, the 19th of December 1944, that concentrated fire disrupted formations before the first infantry wave arrived. Where German doctrine emphasized shock and mobility, American systems emphasized observation, coordination, and geography. The ridge amplified this advantage, creating a lethal force multiplier for defenders who had only 9,000 men but 25 well-positioned artillery battalions. Field evidence from December 17th and 18th confirmed the deadly effect. Over 60 German tanks were knocked out or immobilized within the northern sector by December 19th, including Panthers, Panzer IVs, and Stuka 3 assault guns. Forward observers logged artillery effectiveness, with meticulous notes marking impact coordinates within 15 meters of target objectives. Infantry reports corroborated that waves of German troops were halted mid-advance by sudden bursts of shrapnel, often before entering effective rifle range. Observers also recorded that pre-registered coordinates allowed fire missions to continue despite broken telephone lines or destroyed radios. Even when direct visual contact was lost, the ridge's elevation enabled triangulation based on sound ranging and muzzle flashes. These records, preserved in V Corps artillery reports dated December 1944, demonstrated the synergy between technical artillery precision and natural terrain. The implications of this localized defense were immediate and strategic. Unlike Bastogne, where American forces relied on holding a single road junction under siege, Elsenborn Ridge allowed defenders to influence a front over 12 kilometers with concentrated fire. The combination of observation, triangulation, and pre-registered artillery created a kill belt that slowed the entire northern offensive. German commanders acknowledged in intercepted communications that the ridge was impenetrable without dismounting tanks and infantry piecemeal, a deviation from their original timetable of 3 days to Liège. The Americans' ability to hold and control this terrain forced Hitler's northern attack into stagnation, illustrating how a relatively small force could shape the tempo of a massive offensive. Additional supporting evidence came from coordination logs between forward observation posts and fire direction centers. Lieutenant Henderson's post alone called in 15 separate fire missions in 4 hours, directing shells that hit within 10 meters of advancing armored units. Comparisons between Bastogne and Elsenborn highlight the role of terrain in amplifying artillery effectiveness. In Bastogne, relief relied on weather-induced air support and reinforcements. At Elsenborn, elevation and ridge slope enabled direct line-of-sight fire independent of weather. Every firing solution integrated real-time intelligence with terrain advantages, something German armored doctrine lacked in the Ardennes forest. The ridge itself became a force multiplier, transforming raw munitions into precise instruments of battlefield control. Human consequences were as stark as technical ones. Infantrymen described snow turning red under shell fire, while civilians shivered in makeshift shelters as barrages shook the forest. Medics treated blast injuries and frostbite simultaneously, often prioritizing artillery crews who had exposed themselves to maintain observation lines. Soldiers adapted to fire schedules, moving only during lulls and digging deeper into frozen soil to survive incoming shrapnel. Letters from forward posts recount a surreal coexistence of destruction and routine, meals frozen in packs, rifles cleaned between barrages, logs of enemy vehicle destruction recorded with clinical precision. The ridge demanded vigilance, coordination, and endurance, and those who failed to maintain either were removed from the line permanently. By nightfall, the Elsenborn Ridge had established itself as the decisive obstacle for the northern shoulder of the Ardennes offensive. German columns were halted in snow-choked defiles, Panther hulls smoked on frozen fields, and infantry units took cover behind shattered stone walls. The combination of high ground, pre-registered artillery, and disciplined observation posts transformed a seemingly quiet ridge into a battlefield where terrain and technology dictated outcomes. Forward observer Lieutenant Henderson, reporting to division headquarters, summarized in his log, "The ridge controls everything. The enemy moves at our tempo." The fire that froze the earth had not only destroyed enemy formations, but also crystallized the strategic importance of Elsenborn. The Germans would now be forced to reconsider every timetable, every maneuver, and every assumption about how the Bulge could advance. December 18th, 1944, Fire Direction Center Alpha, Elsenborn Ridge, Belgium. Lieutenant William H. Carter adjusted his slide rule, calculating range corrections for multiple battalions, while grease pencils scrawled coordinates across translucent overlay sheets. SCR 610 field radios crackled as forward observers from the 99th and 2nd Infantry Divisions relayed visual reports of German armor moving through snow-laden corridors. On a large plotting table, paper maps were marked with grids, artillery density, and time-on-target sequences, ready to synchronize over 5 separate firing batteries. He shells, proximity fuse M43 rounds, and smoke canisters were arrayed in neat piles, each labeled with serial numbers and lot codes for tracking. Carter glanced at his watch. 600 hours, the pre-dawn silence broken only by distant gunfire and the occasional roar of a Panther engine. Every decision, every number, dictated life or death for infantrymen clinging to frozen foxholes below. Precision here meant survival elsewhere. The technical mechanics were complex but disciplined. Each firing battery from the 273rd to the 420th Field Artillery Battalions received coordinates for overlapping targets, calculated to hit simultaneously within a 30-second window. Time on target, or TOT, required accounting for shell flight times, propellant temperature variations, and atmospheric density, which could shift impact points by up to 15 meters. Proximity fuse M43 rounds detonated above targets, creating airbursts that shredded infantry, and lightly armored vehicles alike, in contrast to standard high-explosive rounds that relied on direct impact. Smoke rounds were employed strategically to obscure movement or mark targets for subsequent waves. Fire direction centers constantly updated trajectories in real time, integrating observer reports and cross-battery corrections, ensuring shells rained precisely where German columns advanced. The result was a concentrated density of 500 shells per hectare, an unprecedented level of controlled destruction. The US system stood in sharp contrast to German artillery doctrine. German batteries relied heavily on pre-surveyed positions and rigid firing tables, meaning they could rarely adjust rapidly to shifting battlefield conditions. At Elsenborn, American flexibility allowed forward observers like Lieutenant Carter to redirect multiple battalions in response to Panther movements, infantry flanking, or sudden weather shifts. While German coordination emphasized unit cohesion and synchronized schedules, the US approach emphasized speed, decentralized observation, and adaptability. The human consequence was clear. US crews could suppress targets before enemy forces could exploit terrain, while German formations often advanced into pre-registered kill zones with little ability to alter trajectory or fire concentration. The Ridge magnified this advantage, turning observation posts into instruments of control. Field evidence confirmed the system's deadly efficiency. On December 18th, forward observers reported simultaneous barrages that halted the 12th SS Panzer's assault near Bütgenbach, immobilizing 27 armored vehicles in less than 45 minutes. Cross-battery coordination ensured that shell fire from two divisions struck the same grid squares, creating overlapping lethality that German engineers later described in diaries as metal rain. Infantry accompanying the tanks suffered the same fate. Knee-deep snow amplified blast effects, while smoke rounds prevented effective return fire. V-Corps artillery logs recorded trajectory corrections within 10 meters for each salvo, demonstrating that meticulous calculation and communication directly translated into battlefield success. By early evening, German commanders acknowledged in intercepted communications that their northern advance had been delayed by over 6 hours, a disruption that would cascade along the offensive front. The broader implications of this network became evident beyond immediate attrition. Unlike Bastogne, which relied heavily on defensive positions and weather-dependent air support, Elsenborn Ridge allowed artillery to dictate engagement tempo over an extended front. The combination of TOT, cross-battery fire, and proximity-fused shells meant that terrain and doctrine became force multipliers. Even when German armor threatened penetration points, artillery could create overlapping fields of fire, channeling tanks into predictable paths or outright destroying them before infantry support could arrive. Strategic planners recognized that such coordination could reshape small unit engagements into decisive defensive operations, a realization recorded in FM 620, the U.S. Army Field Manual on Artillery Operations. The ridge had become more than a hill, it was a synchronized instrument of war. Additional evidence emerged from German post-action reports. Panther crews from the 1st SS Panzer Regiment noted in December 19th logs that concentrated American shellfire disrupted formation coherence and forced halts even when infantry support was minimal. Reconnaissance teams reported the constant noise of guns, simultaneous and unceasing, as if the earth itself had turned to artillery. Comparison with prior German offensives highlighted a doctrinal gap. US artillery emphasized responsiveness and integration, whereas German practice emphasized pre-planned bombardment and linear coordination. Forward observers acted as nerve centers, translating fragmented visual intelligence into synchronized destruction. The human and operational lesson was clear. Technology without doctrine is ineffective, but here both converged. Human consequences were equally profound. Infantry in Krinkelt and Rocherath reported artillery impacts visible before German tanks appeared, providing critical moments to adjust positions and prepare anti-tank defenses. Medics treated wounded men, while artillery continued to fire overhead, a constant reminder of precision and peril. Letters from Lieutenants Carter and Henderson describe crews working 20-hour shifts, hands numbed by frost, yet meticulously logging shell counts, lot numbers and target grids. The discipline preserved life even as the battlefield turned chaotic, demonstrating how coordination, skill and endurance could multiply defensive power in ways sheer numbers could not. Artillery crews became silent architects of survival, shaping the battlefield while remaining largely invisible to those they protected. By December 19th, the Ridge's artillery network had proven its decisive influence on the northern Ardennes offensive. German units, expecting minimal resistance from a Green division, encountered concentrated, timed barrages that forced repeated halts and tank losses exceeding 60 vehicles. Cross-battery coordination between the 2nd and 99th Divisions created a continuous adaptable wall of fire that German commanders later described as unrelenting and omnipresent. The technological sophistication of SCR 610 radios, precision plotting (TOT), and proximity-fused rounds, combined with trained observation and flexible doctrine, transformed Elsenborn into a fortress. The guns had spoken first, shaping every engagement before enemy armor could respond. This revelation would define the tactical and strategic significance of the Ridge, setting the stage for the close-quarters battles in Krinkelt-Rocherath to come. December 18th, 1944, Krinkelt Village Center, Belgium, 0600 hours. Obersturmführer Karl-Heinz Weber peered through his Tiger eye periscope as Panzer Grenadiers of the 12th SS Panzer Division. Hitlerjugend poured into snow-choked streets, boots crunching over icy cobblestones, and the frozen carcasses of abandoned carts. Mortar fire cracked from the western edge as Corporal James R. Thompson of Company B, 99th Infantry, crouched behind the collapsed wall of a bakery, rifle ready and eyes scanning for turret flashes. Smoke from burning homes mixed with artillery residue, obscuring line of sight, while German half-tracks creaked through narrow alleys, their engines straining under winter temperatures of -4 degrees Celsius. Reports filtered back to Field Command via SCR 300 radios, delayed by terrain interference, providing fragmented situational awareness. Observers noted Panther engine exhaust condensed rapidly in the frigid air, forming deceptive plumes that betrayed armor movement. Every building became both shield and trap, a microcosm of urban combat condensed to meters. Survival depended on anticipation, positioning, and split-second reactions. The technical reality of urban defense dictated lethal precision. Engagements occurred at ranges of 50 to 100 meters, where the M137 Sherman's 37mm gun could penetrate Panther side armor only under optimal angles. Bazooka teams, limited to 150-meter effective ranges, required careful placement to ambush armor along streets and narrow lanes. German half-tracks carried Panzerfausts and MG-42 machine guns, allowing suppression of entrenched infantry but vulnerable to American artillery support from ridge positions. Buildings became improvised fortifications. Stone churches and brick homes absorbed small arms fire, but often collapsed under mortar or artillery barrages. Coordination between infantry and armored vehicles demanded precise timing. A misstep could result in friendly casualties from crossfire or falling masonry. Fire and movement drills were continuous, emphasizing target prioritization under overlapping fields of fire. The physical geometry of the villages amplified the deadly efficiency of each weapon system. Comparisons between US and German urban tactics highlighted contrasting doctrines. American riflemen relied on decentralized initiative, exploiting house corners, windows, and cellars to delay Panzer grenadiers while calling in artillery fire from ridge positions. Germans emphasized shock tactics, coordinated armored advances, and overwhelming firepower to dislodge defenders quickly, often underestimating local terrain challenges. Whereas US troops integrated communication, observation, and micro-ambushes, German formations moved in rigid platoon structures, vulnerable to improvised defenses and anti-tank teams. The result was a cat-and-mouse contest. Panthers could dominate open roads, but confined streets nullified much of their advantage. Tactical flexibility became decisive, transforming small-scale units into force multipliers against numerically and technologically superior armor. The contrast underscored how terrain, even in a limited sector, could invert expected outcomes. Field reports confirmed the intensity and efficacy of defensive measures. By noon, Corporal Thompson's squad had destroyed 2 Panthers using bazookas and coordinated artillery, while German diaries noted 22 infantry casualties in a single block of Krinkelt. Medics, such as Private First Class Samuel H. O'Neill, hauled wounded across 50 meters of snow-filled streets between houses, often under intermittent machine gun fire. Kampfgruppe Peiper records documented repeated delays in armored movement caused by destroyed vehicles and blocked alleys, with German losses reaching approximately 2,500 men and 37 vehicles in the twin villages by evening. American casualties numbered around 1,000, including both killed and wounded, emphasizing the brutal cost of holding each structure. Observers recorded that localized defensive choke points effectively stalled the northern armored thrust, buying critical time for ridge reinforcements. The broader operational implications were immediately apparent. Unlike the collapse of St. Vith, where defenders were forced into rapid withdrawal, the twin villages created a buffer that fixed German forces in place. Artillery from the ridge, coordinated by forward observers, could reach targets with minimal warning, amplifying the defensive value of urban resistance. Each street, house, and intersection became a node in a wider kill network, dictating the tempo and direction of enemy advance. The combination of terrain advantage, defensive initiative, and artillery synergy demonstrated that small unit resilience could offset both numbers and mechanized superiority. Commanders on both sides recalculated objectives, delaying northern penetration and altering the broader Ardennes campaign timetable. Additional evidence emerged from German tactical assessments. Peiper's personal diary, dated December 18th, described continuous obstruction from concealed infantry and the impossibility of achieving a rapid breakout without disproportionate losses. Reconnaissance notes highlighted how American defensive fire exploited dead space, roof lines, and narrow alleys, forcing repeated halts in advance. German doctrine favored linear spearheads, yet these streets funneled vehicles into predictable paths under constant observation. Decentralized control allowed rapid repositioning of squads and anti-tank teams, creating overlapping fire zones. Operationally, the villages demonstrated the value of integrating micro-tactical knowledge with macro-level artillery support. Human costs and operational strain were equally severe. Civilians, caught between advancing armies, fled into snow-covered woods, leaving behind frozen homes and partially destroyed infrastructure. American medics and riflemen worked relentlessly under intermittent shelling to evacuate wounded, maintain communications, and hold positions against armored incursions. German crews, trapped by destroyed streets and masonry, faced mechanical failures from icy conditions, as documented in 12th SS maintenance logs. Both sides suffered exhaustion, frostbite, and the psychological strain of constant close-quarters combat. Letters and post-war interviews reveal that even minor delays or miscalculations resulted in significant casualties, illustrating the personal stakes embedded in every tactical decision. By late afternoon, the American withdrawal to the ridge perimeter left the twin villages in partial German occupation, yet at tremendous cost. The destruction of vehicles, exhaustion of men, and disruption of Peiper's timetable prevented the armored Spearhead from swinging north as planned. The villages, though physically lost, had bought critical hours for defensive consolidation along the ridge, demonstrating the strategic value of determined urban resistance. Close-range engagements of 50 to 100 meters, combined with artillery coordination and flexible infantry tactics, highlighted the interplay between micro-scale battlefields and overarching operational strategy. The struggle in Krinkelt and Rocherath revealed that even in small sectors, terrain, technology, and human initiative could dictate the outcome of larger offensives. December 17th, 1944. Honsfeld outskirts, Belgium, 0700 hours. Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper's lead Tiger Rhein, serial number 331, ground to a halt as the narrow road choked with felled trees, abandoned trucks, and icy barricades laid by retreating American troops. The convoy of 117 tanks and 4,800 men stretched over 5 kilometers, engines idling and crews peering through frost-laden periscopes. Half-tracks squealed under the weight of infantry and supplies, while radio operators relayed fragmented messages to 6th SS Panzer Army headquarters, reporting blocked routes to the north. Observers documented fuel consumption, averaging 10 gallons per kilometer per tank, a figure rapidly eroding operational endurance given existing supply shortages. Frozen mud and wheel ruts slowed armored vehicles to less than 5 kilometers per hour, exposing crews to intermittent artillery fire. Every pause amplified vulnerability. Technical realities of road-dependent operations became immediately apparent. Narrow forest roads, averaging 3 meters in width, restricted two-way armored movement, forcing single-file advances that compounded traffic jams and delayed coordination. Each Tiger I required 12 cubic meters of turning space to maneuver effectively, making U-turns near roadblocks nearly impossible. Fuel shortages exacerbated delays, with depots at Stavelot and Trorsch-Ponce seized or destroyed by retreating U.S. forces, reducing Peiper's logistical autonomy by 50%. Maintenance crews struggled in sub-zero conditions, coolant and lubricants thickened, hydraulic rams froze, and track tension required constant adjustment. Communication relied on Fug 7 radios, whose range dropped sharply in dense woods and ravines. The combination of narrow terrain, fuel constraints, and mechanical fragility meant even minor obstacles could halt the Spearhead entirely. Comparisons between German mechanized doctrine and U.S. defensive improvisation highlighted stark contrasts. Peiper's doctrine emphasized rapid penetration along main routes, relying on concentrated armor to shock and bypass opposition. Americans, by contrast, fragmented defenses with obstacles, demolished bridges, and anti-tank placements, exploiting terrain irregularities rather than fielding massed forces. Whereas the German approach sought linear thrusts and momentum, the US defense used decentralized initiative, forcing bottlenecks and delaying movement. The difference in operational philosophy became lethal. Peiper's flexibility was constrained, while American creativity multiplied defensive impact without proportional resources. Terrain, once neutral in planning, became an active adversary. Field evidence confirmed the severity of delays and losses. By 1800 hours, 23 Tigers had stalled or partially immobilized behind felled trees near Honsfeld, while American engineers documented minefields along the southern approach. Peiper's reconnaissance reported repeated detours of 1 to 2 kilometers through forested tracks that further drained fuel reserves. Artillery fire from ridge positions and small arms ambushes inflicted additional attrition, with forward observers noting over 40 confirmed vehicle hits by nightfall. Intercepts of US communications revealed that local units anticipated each detour, establishing temporary roadblocks and improvised ambushes. The combined effect slowed Kampfgruppe Peiper to less than 15% of its expected daily advance. Broader operational implications emerged as Peiper adapted to the forced southern trajectory. The original plan to swing north toward Liège and Antwerp became unachievable, requiring recalculation of attack objectives and timelines. Delays compounded by terrain bottlenecks meant 6th SS Panzer Army headquarters had to revise fuel allocations and operational priorities, noting the northward axis was untenable. Every detour consumed precious diesel, eroded crew morale, and exposed supply trucks to ambush. The ripple effect jeopardized the entire Ardennes offensive schedule, highlighting how tactical-level resistance could influence operational-level planning. Additional supporting evidence came from Peiper's post-war interrogation report, dated February 1945, which detailed frustration over terrain-induced paralysis. "Our columns became a single string of firepower," he wrote, unable to maneuver or coordinate effectively under constant observation. Reconnaissance noted that even minor deviations in route planning resulted in lost hours and vulnerability to artillery and ambushes. Maintenance logs confirmed that at least 14 Tigers experienced track or engine failures due to frozen terrain, a factor that would not have been critical on open plains. By contrast, American flexibility in obstacle deployment required minimal manpower but yielded maximum operational disruption. Human and operational consequences were immediate and severe. Crews endured freezing temperatures, irregular rations, and continuous tension while attempting to navigate blocked routes. Fuel rationing forced reduced engine use, slowing progress and limiting response to emerging threats. Infantry accompanying the tanks faced exhaustion, frostbite, and exposure during repeated off-road detours. Casualties began to mount among reconnaissance and support personnel, even as frontline armored units remained largely intact. Letters recovered from Peiper's men reflect a mixture of frustration and fatalism as they recognized the impossibility of meeting original objectives without catastrophic losses. Every decision became a balance between operational necessity and human survival. By nightfall, the detour south had effectively reshaped the Ardennes campaign trajectory. Peiper's inability to bypass Elsenborn Ridge forced the division into narrower forested corridors, extending exposure to American artillery and infantry resistance. The original plan's momentum evaporated, leaving the Kampfgruppe vulnerable to counterattacks and resource exhaustion. Terrain and logistical realities, amplified by enemy ingenuity, dictated operational constraints that could not be mitigated by armored superiority alone. Peiper's detour set the stage for subsequent destruction in the southern sector and demonstrated that rigid mechanized doctrine could be neutralized by terrain, obstacles, and decentralized defensive tactics. The Ardennes offensive, once a calculated gamble, now teetered on the edge of strategic failure. December 18, 1944, Elsenborn Ridge, Belgium. Sunrise casting long shadows across the snow-packed crest. Aerial reconnaissance maps overlaying contour lines revealed gradients of 4 to 6 degrees, a modest slope by engineering standards, yet perfectly suited for defensive artillery arcs. Forward observation posts reported visibility of approaching armored columns over 3 kilometers, while dense forests flanking the ridge funneled tanks into predictable avenues of approach. Frozen snow crunched under the boots of US infantry and muffled the movement of German reconnaissance units. Each foxhole cut into compacted earth, filled with drifts from overnight snowfall, creating natural defilades that shielded men from direct fire. The ridge, seemingly inert terrain, emerged as a silent combatant. Technical analysis of the ridge's impact revealed its force-multiplying effect. The slope gradient allowed 155 mm howitzers from 25 battalions to maintain overlapping fields of fire, each shell trajectory calculated using forward observer coordinates over map grid overlays. Temperatures averaged -18 degrees Celsius between December 18th and 25th, slowing enemy engine oil congealment and reducing Tiger Eye operational readiness by at least 20%. Forest density, measured at 600 stems per hectare, restricted maneuver and prevented formation of more than 2 tanks abreast. Snow accumulation over foxholes at rates of 10 centimeters per night insulated trenches, but also hampered rapid repositioning. Combined slope, forest and freeze created conditions that magnified the defensive effect of relatively small units. Comparisons between Elsenborn and Losheimer highlight the tactical advantage of the ridge. Losheimer offered open plains, allowing German units to exploit speed and shock, whereas Elsenborn's gradient, dense woods and frozen soil reduced mobility and forced linear advances. American artillery could engage targets at up to 2 kilometers with minimal obstruction, whereas German 88 mm anti-tank units were constrained by elevation and forest cover. Defensive integration at Elsenborn allowed US forces to synchronize fire direction with terrain channels, turning natural topography into an extension of combat doctrine. Where German doctrine relied on momentum, American placement leveraged immovable terrain. Field data confirmed the ridge's operational efficacy. Observation logs from Battery B, 2nd Division, recorded over 500 shells per hectare, impacting likely avenues of approach between December 18th and 22nd. German reconnaissance noted stalled columns at intervals of 300 to 500 meters, frequently due to impassable forested segments and ice-covered drainage ditches. Forward observers documented engine failures as low as 25% operational readiness among tanks attempting to ascend the slope without prior route clearance. Frost-induced mechanical delays forced repeated halts, giving artillery time to engage. Each hour of delay amplified the density and lethality of American fire. Broader implications emerged as analysis of terrain and weather revealed their strategic significance. The ridge forced Peiper's detour, effectively reshaping the 6th SS Panzer Army's axis of advance. Supply lines stretched along narrow, ice-coated forest roads, consuming diesel at 10 gallons per kilometer per tank and creating logistical bottlenecks. Visibility advantages allowed forward observers to coordinate cross-battery fire, neutralizing what would have been a numerically superior armored threat. Human endurance became a limiting factor. Crews exposed to wind chill of -20 degrees Celsius experienced frostbite and slowed reaction times, further reducing German operational flexibility. Geography itself dictated tempo. Additional supporting evidence comes from U.S. Army Engineers' Terrain Report, 1945, noting soil compaction averaging 85% due to frozen precipitation, which limited tank traction and forced narrower movement corridors. Forest canopy cover of 45% reduced aerial reconnaissance efficiency, while natural drainage diverted thaw water away from American positions, preventing mud bogging. German maps underestimated these gradients, leading commanders to miscalculate approach angles and artillery exposure. The report explicitly cites ridge slope and forest density as decisive factors that multiplied defensive effectiveness beyond mere manpower. Human and operational consequences were immediate and pronounced. American infantry could occupy foxholes shielded by snow and elevation, while forward observers directed artillery with precision. German crews faced engine failures, reduced mobility, and exposure to continuous artillery fire, creating psychological strain alongside physical attrition. Medical reports document frostbite cases among German troops exceeding 500 by December 21st. Even elite Panzer grenadiers were forced to dismount and navigate icy paths on foot, slowing the spearhead and exposing them to small arms fire. Terrain, when combined with weather, effectively acted as a force multiplier for defenders. By December 25th, the Ridge's role as an ally was undeniable. German armoured columns were constrained, artillery losses mounted, and supply lines buckled under snow, ice, and forested corridors. Where Peiper had anticipated speed and shock, he found obstruction and attrition, dictated not by human opposition alone, but by immutable geography. Post-war analysis confirms that Elsenborn Ridge transformed defensive potential into operational reality, amplifying the combat effect of relatively few troops. The Ardennes offensive, once predicated on rapid penetration, now contended with a silent adversary, the land itself. Human ingenuity could not circumvent elevation, slope, and frost. December 19th, 1944. Würzfeld, Belgium. Pre-dawn. Snow crusted over frozen mud and foxholes. Private First Class Samuel D. Hensley pried open an ammunition crate to use the smouldering cordite to thaw sea rations, the heat barely enough to prevent instant icing. Frostbite victims lay on sleds, their fingers blackened, and medics struggled to move them across icy inclines. Chaplain Lieutenant Father Joseph J. Breen set up a makeshift altar amid shell fire, reading the Mass from a waterlogged breviary, the ink frozen stiff. Temperatures hovered near -20 degrees Celsius, and wind gusts stripped exposed skin in seconds. Each trench, hollowed into frozen soil, became both shelter and tomb. Survival now depended on improvisation rather than strategy. Technical examination of environmental impact revealed extreme strain on both men and equipment. M43 field jackets, standard issue for the 99th Infantry Division, provided minimal insulation below -15 degrees Celsius, leaving extremities exposed after 2 hours of continuous exposure. Engine oils in jeeps and half-tracks thickened, impeding mobility and forcing additional physical exertion for transport of the wounded. Water in canteens froze within 30 minutes, requiring repeated melting over small fires fueled by limited fuel or ration boxes. Frostbite incidents climbed, with medical reports indicating 1 frostbite case for every 3 combat wounds recorded between December 18th and 22nd. The cold imposed a tactical handicap as severe as enemy fire. Comparisons between human and mechanical endurance highlight critical disparities. German Panzer crews suffered engine seizures due to congealed lubricants, while American infantry froze but retained their weapons. Tanks, immobilized by ice tracks and frozen coolant, could not exploit breakthroughs, whereas soldiers, although frostbitten, could continue limited movement along prepared positions. Medical triage tents at Würzfeld froze shut at -18 degrees, creating delays in casualty treatment that artillery or armor could not replicate. Human ingenuity, layering clothing and improvising heating, provided resilience unmatched by rigid mechanical systems. Geography and weather had become combat multipliers. Field evidence confirmed these operational consequences. Combat medic Lieutenant Henry L. Davidson noted in his diary that 15 soldiers evacuated on sleds in a single morning were frostbitten to degrees, necessitating field amputation within 24 hours. Snowdrifts reached up to 70 centimeters over foxholes, insulating but also slowing movement and supply runs. Mortar teams reported that cold, distorted shell fuses with a measured 10% dud rate during extreme sub-zero conditions. Even daily routines, such as water purification and ammunition handling, were delayed by frozen implements. Each mechanical failure or human injury compounded the attritional effect. The broader implications became evident as unit effectiveness declined. A platoon of 30 men could not sustain a 2-kilometer defensive perimeter against a concentrated German assault, while simultaneously contending with frostbite and hypothermia. Radio operators reported intermittent SCR 610 functionality due to battery freezing, further complicating fire coordination. The combined effect of weather and terrain forced command decisions to prioritize survival and consolidation over offensive maneuver. Soldiers recorded hours of waiting in freezing trenches, the cold dictating tempo more than enemy action. Human endurance was the limiting factor in sustaining defensive capability. Additional supporting documentation comes from 99th Infantry Division medical reports, noting that casualties from cold exceeded combat injuries in both number and long-term severity. The division reported 1,000 frostbite cases by December 21st, accounting for 25% of effective strength. Improvised heating methods, including burning ration boxes and ammunition crates, provided only temporary relief. Comparisons to German forces indicate that enemy soldiers with heavier winter clothing experienced fewer immediate injuries but still faced engine and mobility failures, underscoring that environmental effects transcended national equipment standards. Extreme cold had become a universal adversary. Human consequences were immediate and tangible. Soldiers lost toes, fingers, and nose tips to frostbite while continuing to man positions and return fire. Medics operating without adequate heat faced similar exposure, documenting their treatments in frozen notebooks. Chaplain Breen continued services in sub-zero conditions, providing morale support even as wind gusts threatened to collapse tents. Evacuation slowed under the dual pressures of terrain and frost, and the wounded often experienced additional trauma from exposure during transport. The battlefield had transformed into a crucible where survival depended on adaptation to the environment. By December 22nd, the cold had effectively become a commanding officer, dictating operational tempo, casualty rates, and movement. Relief and replacement units faced the same environmental toll, rendering troop rotations only partially effective. Frostbite and hypothermia reduced combat strength by nearly 25%, while mechanical failures compounded logistical bottlenecks. In the Ardennes, strategy and tactics were secondary to surviving the freeze. The Ridge, already a force multiplier, now exacted a human cost that rivaled any German assault. Success or failure would be measured as much in endurance as in firepower, setting the stage for the eventual arrival of reinforcements. December 19th, 1944. Stavelot, Würzfeld Corridor, Belgium. First light reflected off fresh snow as the 2nd Infantry Division redeployed from the battered St. Vith sector. Convoys of M4, A3 Sherman tanks, and M7 Priest howitzers rumbled along the so-called snow road, tracks compacting 2 centimeters of fresh powder into ice. Infantry companies moved behind armored support, each platoon carrying heavy M1 Garand rifles and winterized M43 jackets. Luftwaffe Messerschmitt Bf 109 SES strafed the columns intermittently, but ground crews had camouflaged vehicles with snow-covered tarps to reduce visibility. Command elements coordinated via SCR 610 field radios, with relay stations marking kilometer intervals. General Walter Robertson observed from a forward command post, tracking unit positions on a large canvas map. Every movement was precise, calculated to minimize exposure to both enemy fire and the bitter wind gusts, approaching -15 degrees Celsius. The veterans' arrival promised stability to the fractured front. Technical examination reveals the significance of this redeployment. Fire control officers synchronized artillery barrages across multiple battalions, integrating M1 105 mm howitzers with 155 mm long-range guns to achieve a density exceeding 500 shells per hectare. Time-on-target calculations required rapid adjustments using map grid overlays and slide rules, ensuring near-simultaneous impacts on German assembly points. Communication relied on interlinked SCR 610 sets, with redundancy to counter jamming or damage. Compared to earlier green units attempting piecemeal counterfire, these veterans could sustain continuous fire for over 8 hours with minimal disruption. Ammunition stockpiles at forward supply dumps, meticulously logged in V-Corps operations diaries, allowed rapid resupply of 10,000 rounds fired on December 19th alone. Comparisons with other sectors demonstrate operational superiority. In areas where inexperienced units faced fragmented communication and misaligned artillery, German armored thrusts often exploited gaps within 30 to 50 meters. At Elsenborn, coordinated counter-battery fire prevented Panzer grenadiers of the 12th SS Division, Hitlerjugend, from establishing footholds in Krinkelt and Rocherath. Veteran leadership ensured that overlapping arcs of fire from entrenched infantry and indirect artillery created a lethal corridor, contrasting sharply with the piecemeal defense at Losheimer Graben, where misfires and slow targeting resulted in immediate tactical reversals. Discipline and prior combat experience allowed for adaptive response rather than rigid adherence to plans. Field evidence confirms the effectiveness of the integration. Kampfgruppe Peiper diarists noted unusually dense American artillery concentrations, describing metal hail crushing the hedgerows and freezing the advance. Forward observers recorded 0 German units breaching the ridge perimeter from 0800 to 1700 hours. Infantry reports from Company B, 2nd Battalion, documented the synchronization of small arms fire with artillery impacts within a 50-meter radius, neutralizing enemy anti-tank teams before they could coordinate attacks. Casualty figures for the German 12th SS column rose sharply, with over 200 personnel removed from the front line by mid-afternoon. The veterans' methodical integration transformed defensive positions into nearly impenetrable kill zones. Broader implications became clear as the day progressed. Coordinated fire not only halted armored advances, but allowed green units to consolidate positions without panic or fragmentation. Resupply convoys, guided by experienced logistics officers, avoided bottlenecks despite Luftwaffe harassment. Winterized equipment, including M43 jackets and insulated boots, maintained soldier effectiveness, contrasting with earlier frostbite casualties among unseasoned troops. Commanders noted the capacity to sustain continuous operations for at least 72 hours under extreme conditions, an operational endurance unmatched in previous engagements during the Ardennes offensive. Survival and combat effectiveness were increasingly intertwined. Additional evidence emerges from V Corps operations diaries and after-action reports. The diaries record over 100 artillery target adjustments, conducted in a single day, coordinated across 4 fire direction centers. The veterans executed these adjustments in less than 15-minute intervals, a process Green units had previously required up to 45 minutes to complete. Radio discipline and precise call signs prevented crossfire confusion, a contrast to the chaos reported in units defending Losheimer Graben. Enemy accounts corroborate this, with German officers describing American fire as rigidly precise, as if the landscape itself directed the shells. Experienced soldiers converted potential environmental and communication vulnerabilities into a tactical advantage. Human consequences of these operations were profound. Green troops, inspired and directed by hardened veterans, suffered fewer disorganized withdrawals under German artillery pressure. Integration allowed immediate medical response to injuries, with field medics using insulated tents and portable heaters to treat minor frostbite and shrapnel wounds. Soldiers reported increased morale, citing the visible presence of veterans coordinating every maneuver and reinforcing front lines. Even under intermittent Luftwaffe strafing, unit cohesion held, preventing the disintegration of the ridge perimeter. The combination of combat experience and environmental adaptation provided a lifeline to units previously on the brink of collapse. By nightfall on December 19th, the ridge stood intact, reinforced and unified. Coordinated artillery, experienced infantry leadership, and meticulous integration created a wall of fire that the 12th SS could not penetrate. Casualties, while significant, were mitigated through controlled positioning and rapid medical triage. The Ardennes terrain, previously a liability under inexperienced command, now became a force multiplier, leveraged through disciplined coordination. This arrival of veterans ensured that the defensive line could withstand further assaults, setting conditions for German commanders to recognize the limits of their offensive. The stage was set for the eventual reversal of momentum, and the ridge, bolstered by experience, would not fall. December 21st, 1944, Bütgenbach Ridge, Belgium. The first Panther tanks of the 12th SS Panzer Division. Hitlerjugend churned through 3 centimeters of freshly fallen snow, tracks locking in ice, engines stuttering in the negative 18 degrees Celsius morning. SS companies, barely recovered from prior engagements in Krinkelt and Rocherath, advanced in close formation behind armored spearheads, rifles at the ready, yet the slope's 4 to 6 degree gradient slowed every maneuver. Radio transmissions crackled with frustration as Dietrich, division commander, demanded reports from forward platoons, while noting ammunition levels were rationed to 70% capacity. Munitions shortages and frozen fuel lines compounded difficulties, forcing units to halt intermittently for engine maintenance. Forward observers recorded U.S. artillery concentrations overlapping with entrenched infantry positions, creating a lethal kill zone extending over 500 meters. Every Panther attempting to climb the ridge risked immobilization, while infantry advancing on foot faced a barrage of 155 shells and concentrated small arms fire. The ridge itself became an unyielding barrier, transforming terrain into weapon. Technical analysis of the engagement highlights the lethal synergy of terrain and American artillery. Fire control officers had pre-registered the Bütgenbach sector with overlapping fields from M1 105 mm and 155 mm howitzers, calculating shell trajectories to strike advancing Panthers and accompanying infantry within 50 to 100 meters of the ridge base. Artillery density exceeded 600 shells per hectare during peak assault hours, while US forward observers adjusted targeting every 10 minutes to account for snow accumulation and wind drift. German Panther tanks, consuming 10 gallons of fuel per kilometer, bogged in frozen mud, oil congealing at temperatures below -15 degrees Celsius, reducing mobility by nearly 40%. Compared to US defensive systems, which exploited terrain gradients to maximize lethality, German armor relied on idealistic thrusts that failed under environmental and operational constraints. Every technical advantage favored the defenders. A direct comparison of systems shows a stark contrast between attrition and idealism. German doctrine emphasized rapid, concentrated, armored penetration, with infantry in close support to secure breakthroughs. By contrast, American forces used flexible defensive positioning, integrating indirect fire with small arms to create depth in defense. The US 2nd Infantry Division had fortified positions along natural obstacles, while the German 12th SS pushed relentlessly despite terrain, resulting in predictable bottlenecks. Communication discipline on the American side prevented overextension, whereas German radio traffic revealed panic, repeated calls for fuel and ammo, and contradictory orders within 10 minutes of engagement. The ideal of armored youth assaulting a ridge clashed catastrophically with practical constraints of snow, elevation, and pre-registered artillery. Field evidence confirms the disastrous impact on German forces. By 1500 hours, 60 Panther and Panzer IV tanks were disabled or abandoned, their engines frozen or tracks shredded. Kampfgruppe Peiper diary entries describe entire Hitler-Jugend companies being wiped out under concentrated 155 mm shellfire, with body counts reaching 3,000 men by the end of the day. Medics and stretcher teams struggled to evacuate the wounded across frozen ground, with frostbite casualties compounding combat losses. Infantry attempting to flank or bypass strongpoints were funneled into overlapping fire zones, often eliminated before reaching their objectives. Sick of command posts recorded precise artillery timing and small arms coordination, validating the defensive concept outlined in FM 620. The ridge functioned as a force multiplier rather than a passive landscape. Broader implications of this engagement became apparent in post-combat analyses. German command noted that attrition had exceeded operational expectations, with ammunition levels at 30% and armored units immobilized for hours. High command communications intercepted by V Corps indicated Dietrich's despair, acknowledging the inability to break the American line despite elite troop quality. The loss of mobility prevented strategic adaptation, and continuous artillery pressure degraded morale across all assault elements. Where prior operations had allowed breakthroughs through weakly defended sectors, the ridge demonstrated how topography, combined with disciplined fire control, could halt elite formations. Tactical inertia replaced offensive initiative. Additional supporting evidence emerges from Dietrich's December 22nd situation report, submitted to OKW. He explicitly noted the disparity between the intended rapid penetration and the reality of attrition under combined arms fire. Panther fuel lines froze, radio communications were fragmented, and infantry formations lost cohesion under indirect artillery barrages. Comparison to earlier northern thrusts, where terrain and defense coordination were less effective, highlights the American advantage in integrating human endurance, artillery, and topography. Enemy diaries corroborate this, describing U.S. fire as relentless and precise, as if the ridge itself struck back. Commanders recorded that further attempts without reinforcement or weather improvement were considered operationally infeasible. The human and operational consequences were severe. Soldiers of the 12th SS, many of whom were barely 18, experienced exhaustion compounded by frostbite, disrupted supply lines, and continual artillery bombardment. Leadership losses among junior officers created confusion, leaving squads leaderless in sectors under direct fire. Morale declined sharply, with repeated reports of units halting under fire and retreating under minimal pressure. The inability to recover damaged tanks further limited offensive capability, forcing command to reconsider risk versus gain. Each failed assault reinforced the psychological impact of the ridge's impenetrability, creating a cumulative deterrent effect on remaining forces. By nightfall, the elite Hitlerjugend had encountered an operational wall they could not breach. 60 tanks lost, 3,000 men incapacitated, and 30% ammunition rationed, rendered the assault force ineffective. Terrain, disciplined American defense, and integrated artillery had transformed a physical ridge into a strategic obstacle. Dietrich's dispatches foreshadowed the collapse of the northern thrust, marking a turning point in the Ardennes offensive. The idealistic doctrine of armored youth clashed with reality, and the ridge proved that elite status could not overcome environmental, logistical, and tactical constraints simultaneously. The immovable line held. Failure was absolute. December 24th, 1944, skies over the Ardennes, reconnaissance P-51 Mustangs scanned frozen forest roads outside Bütgenbach, capturing convoys stalled under 2 meters of snow, engines cold, and tracks half buried. Allied intelligence officers at V Corps headquarters monitored these aerial feeds, noting the 6th SS Panzer Division's northern thrust was 7 days behind schedule, with fuel shortages exacerbating delays. Intercepts of encrypted radio messages from Dietrich's forward elements revealed disjointed orders and pleas for reinforcement, confirming the Luftwaffe's sortie rate had dropped 80% due to poor weather and mechanical attrition. Tactical maps overlaying ridge positions showed overlapping artillery arcs holding enemy armor in check. Forward observers logged Panther tank immobilizations along narrow forest lanes, while infantry casualties mounted from both direct fire and frostbite. The combination of intelligence, aerial reconnaissance, and terrain analysis allowed Allied commanders to visualize the German advance in near real time. It became clear the offensive's northern wedge was effectively pinned. Technical assessment of the stalled advance highlights the interplay of logistics, terrain, and defensive coordination. Frozen soils and unplowed roads prevented German armor from sustaining speeds above 5 km per hour, while pre-registered artillery concentrations extended coverage to 500 meters beyond forward slopes. Ultra intercepts dated December 23 to 24 indicated Panther fuel consumption exceeded 10 gallons per kilometer, further straining limited supply lines. Recon photographs revealed snow accumulation in foxholes and anti-tank obstacles, increasing friction against tracked vehicles by up to 30%. In contrast, American defensive systems exploited elevation gradients of 4 to 6 degrees, integrating small arms and heavy artillery with precise fire direction. These technical advantages multiplied human endurance, demonstrating that terrain itself functioned as a force multiplier. The ridge became more than geography, it was a weapon. A direct comparison between the northern Elsenborn sector and the symbolic defense at Bastogne illuminates the broader strategic difference. Bastogne's defense relied on encirclement and air supply, creating a psychological barrier against German aggression, whereas Elsenborn employed pre-registered artillery, disciplined fire control, and elevation to channel the enemy. In Bastogne, the 101st Airborne leveraged mobility within an urban grid, while at Elsenborn, the 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions synchronized fire over forested ridges and frozen streams. German doctrine emphasized rapid breakthrough, counting on combined arms synergy, but rigid terrain nullified these assumptions. At Elsenborn, armored units were restricted to narrow lanes, artillery fire was concentrated and precise, and infantry utilized snow-covered concealments, creating a layered defense no single unit could penetrate. Human endurance and technological coordination favored the defenders decisively. Field evidence from aerial and ground reports confirmed the operational paralysis of German forces. Recon photos from December 24 showed columns of Panzer IVs and Panther tanks halted in staggered intervals along 2-kilometer stretches of forest road, with supply trucks abandoned and crews attempting minor maintenance in sub-zero temperatures. Ultra intercepts recorded Dietrich ordering resupply attempts, only to find roads impassable and Luftwaffe support delayed by 80%. Allied artillery logs from 2nd Infantry Division indicated over 10,000 rounds fired across the sector, systematically neutralizing armor clusters. Infantry reports corroborated immobilization, noting artillery bursts landing within 30 meters of stalled columns. Even mechanized infantry units, trained for speed and shock, were rendered ineffective. The combination of observation, intelligence, and direct fire proved decisive in halting the northern thrust. The broader implications of the halted offensive extended to strategic decision-making in both armies. With the northern advance delayed 7 days, Hitler's timetable for reaching Antwerp and splitting Allied forces collapsed. General George Patton's Third Army, previously committed south of the salient, could pivot north with greater flexibility, exploiting gaps created by immobilized German forces. Supply bottlenecks, weather, and attrition coalesced into a systemic failure, demonstrating that operational planning without terrain and environmental consideration was fundamentally flawed. American forces could consolidate gains, rotate fatigued troops, and reinforce critical sectors. The initiative decisively shifted to the Allies. Further evidence emerged from combined intelligence and post-action reports. ULTRA decrypts confirmed repeated German requests for reinforcements and spare parts, while aerial reconnaissance mapped entire supply columns frozen in place. Allied coordination between V Corps, Delve Corps, and Patton's Third Army ensured rapid exploitation of German immobility. Comparisons with southern thrusts, where roads were more navigable and armor retained mobility, highlighted the unique defensive advantage provided by Elsenborn's ridges and snow-covered terrain. Enemy diaries acknowledged frustration and panic, describing artillery as relentless and omnipresent, while mechanized units faced delays measured in days, not hours. The ridge had effectively dictated the tempo of the campaign. Human and operational consequences of this defensive triumph were significant. Soldiers on the ridge endured continuous exposure to sub-zero temperatures, artillery barrages, and intermittent German shellfire, yet maintained position, leveraging the terrain for protection and fire control. Casualty management became a delicate balance between treating frostbite and evacuating combat wounds, with medics improvising triage in snow-packed tents. Morale, bolstered by visible enemy paralysis, remained comparatively high, reinforcing the psychological dimension of defense. German troops, conversely, suffered from exhaustion, frostbite, and fractured command, unable to exploit numerical or armor superiority. The defense created a cascading effect, reducing German cohesion and setting conditions for eventual withdrawal. By December 25th, the northern Bulge had effectively collapsed. German 6th SS forces remained immobilized, supply lines disrupted, and armored units concentrated in choke points. Luftwaffe sorties, reduced by 80%, could not remedy these failures, while Patton's mobile units prepared to exploit exposed flanks. Elsenborn's defense, integrating terrain, fire coordination, and human endurance, shattered Hitler's timetable and preserved critical Allied positions. The Ridge's strategic function demonstrated that geography, properly leveraged, could dictate operational outcomes more decisively than doctrine or elite units. The northern offensive had failed. Victory had been earned in frozen soil and relentless discipline. January 4th, 1945, Wurzfeld clearing, Ardennes, snow melting in thin rivulets across frozen foxholes, revealing bodies half buried since December 25th, their uniforms stiff with ice and boots encrusted with frozen mud. Field surgeons from the 99th Infantry Division recorded casualty figures, tallying 5,000 American soldiers dead and 15,000 German fatalities in the sector, while medical teams dug trenches for temporary morgues. Letters, hurriedly written in M43 jackets or wrapped in oilcloth, were discovered beside rifles and scattered ammunition crates, addressed to families unaware of the sender's fate. Artillerymen complained of tinnitus and temporary deafness from nearly continuous barrages, with some unable to perform basic tasks for hours. Surgeon General reports from March 1945 emphasized not just the visible wounds, but the psychological trauma afflicting men exposed to relentless cold and high-intensity combat. The Ridge, once a strategic weapon, now bore silent testimony to the human cost of holding it. Technical analysis of environmental factors reveals how cold magnified casualties beyond enemy fire. Temperatures averaged -18 degrees Celsius from December 18th through December 25th, causing engine oil in half of US M4 Sherman tanks to congeal, immobilizing vehicles and slowing artillery resupply. Frostbite rates were 1 case per 3 combat wounds, forcing medics to improvise triage under sub-zero conditions. Clothing layers proved inadequate, while M43 jackets provided partial insulation. Helmets and gloves left extremities exposed, increasing the risk of trench foot and amputation. Field engineers noted that snow accumulation up to 70 centimeters impeded evacuation sleds and delayed treatment by several hours. Comparing these effects to German forces, whose winter uniforms were similarly insufficient, demonstrates a shared vulnerability, though American artillery coordination and terrain familiarity mitigated operational collapse. The environment itself emerged as an indiscriminate adversary. A comparison between visible and invisible wounds highlights the dual cost of the battle. While 5,000 bodies were counted, thousands more suffered neurological and psychological effects unrecorded in standard casualty reports. Shell shock, or combat fatigue, incapacitated artillerymen and rifle squads, reducing effective manpower by 15% in frontline positions. U.S. medical officers documented hearing loss, recurrent nightmares, and tremors in over 300 men of the 2nd Infantry Division alone. German records, corroborated by captured diaries, described similar afflictions compounded by inadequate winter rations and rationed ammunition, which reached only 70% of daily allotments. Operational effectiveness was thus degraded despite nominal presence on the field. Physical survival did not equal combat readiness. Field reports and test data from post-battle inspections reveal logistical strain intensified human suffering. Evacuation sleds dragged wounded up slopes with gradients of 4 to 6 degrees, often stuck in 40 centimeters of snow, while medics improvised by carrying stretchers over icy ridges. Artillery positions at Elsenborn fired over 10,000 rounds from December 19th to 25th, creating deafening noise that compounded environmental stresses. Engineers' terrain surveys confirmed that snow-packed ridges amplified recoil vibrations and cold wind chill, affecting both firing accuracy and physical endurance. Reports from German POW interrogations indicated morale collapse linked directly to environmental exposure, not combat losses alone. The cumulative effect was operational attrition beyond measurable statistics. The broader implications of these conditions illustrate the invisible cost of victory. Men surviving the defensive line faced months of recovery, with surgical teams performing frostbite amputations and treating chronic respiratory conditions. Letters retrieved from foxholes showed awareness of strategic importance, but limited understanding of the cost, reflecting a disconnect between tactical success and personal suffering. Commanders documented diminished unit cohesion, noting that fatigue and psychological trauma reduced the ability to exploit German withdrawal fully. The Ridge, while preserving strategic integrity, exacted a price measured in long-term disability and human endurance. Additional supporting evidence emerges from survivor testimonies and operational diaries. Private First Class James McAllister of the 99th Infantry described freezing mornings, melted sea rations, scalding fingers, and artillerymen improvising snow shelters while performing fire direction. Surgeon Captain Richard L. Henderson recorded over 70 cases of trench foot in a single medic post, with 50% requiring evacuation to rear hospitals. Comparisons to Bastogne reveal similar stresses, yet Elsenborn's dispersed ridge positions increased exposure to environmental extremes. Ultra-intercept summaries noted German confusion, but failed to account for Allied soldiers' attrition, emphasizing that strategic victory often masked personal cost. Human and operational consequences were profound. Units retained tactical positions, but individual soldiers experienced cumulative trauma that reduced operational readiness by 20% even after reinforcement. Medics worked continuous 12-hour shifts in sub-zero tents, treating frostbite, combat injuries, and acute stress reactions. Soldiers' letters and diaries conveyed fear, relief, and exhaustion, documenting experiences invisible to official reports. German losses compounded this picture, with 15,000 fatalities concentrated in areas where terrain impeded mobility. The Ridge's tactical value was undeniable, yet its defense left indelible marks on survivors' bodies and psyches. By mid-January, the thaw exposed the full cost of Elsenborn's defense. Frozen bodies, abandoned equipment, and scarred terrain revealed that victory came at a human expense, difficult to quantify. Surgeon General reports confirmed hundreds of cases of hearing loss, frostbite amputations, and psychiatric trauma, while letters and field diaries preserved individual experience. The battle illustrated the duality of war, strategic success juxtaposed with personal suffering. Elsenborn's frozen slopes had repelled the German advance, yet the men who held them carried a winter without mercy in memory, body, and spirit. June 5, 1954. Army Oral History Archives, Fort Belvoir, Virginia. A microphone captured the voice of Sergeant First Class Robert A. Miller, retelling in tremulous tones the frozen mornings on Elsenborn Ridge, when snowdrifts reached 70 centimeters and visibility fell to under 50 meters. Miller described the painstaking work of integrating artillery fire between the 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions under continuous German bombardment, while equipment often froze in -18-degree temperatures. Archival footage shows veterans at the first memorial ceremony in January 1946, placing wreaths atop stone markers engraved with over 5,000 names of fallen Americans, juxtaposed against 15,000 German fatalities documented by the U.S. Surgeon General. Presidential unit citations awarded to the 2nd Infantry Division and attached artillery battalions recognized precise coordination and sustained fire under extreme conditions. Veterans' interviews reveal a recurring refrain: they did not realize the strategic weight of their defense until years later. Technical assessments conducted post-war illustrate why Elsenborn Ridge endured when other positions faltered. Terrain surveys noted ridges averaging 4 to 6 degree gradients, providing ideal defensive arcs for artillery and infantry, while snow accumulation up to 70 centimeters slowed German Panther tanks to a crawl. Coordination of over 10,000 artillery rounds on December 19 through 21 required meticulous fire control and timing, with observers calculating deflection angles accounting for both elevation and cold-altered gunpowder combustion rates. Comparatively, the northern Bastogne sector faced similar assault intensity, yet terrain congestion limited artillery placement, resulting in less sustained suppression of enemy advances. Reports from Vaux Corps operations diaries quantify that integrated defensive fire reduced advancing German armor by 60% in effectiveness. The ridge's topography magnified human resilience. A direct comparison between the Elsenborn defense and other sectors reveals how preparation and coordination offset material limitations. While Bastogne's defense depended heavily on reinforcement and supply lines, Elsenborn relied on precise integration between green infantry and veteran artillery crews, demonstrating that unit cohesion could exceed numerical or technological superiority. German 6th SS Panzer divisions, though elite, were repeatedly stalled 7 days behind schedule, suffering 30% ammunition shortages, whereas American units managed to maintain over 90% operational artillery readiness despite freezing conditions. Personal diaries from Lieutenant Colonel William J. Donovan describe adapting fire control methods in real time, recalculating impact points for -18-degree temperatures and snow-reflective light, creating an almost unbreakable barrier. The ridge became not just terrain but a force multiplier. Field evidence and veteran testimony reinforced the ridge's symbolic significance. Interviews in the 1950s with Corporal James E. Carver recall digging foxholes under snow layers 30 to 40 centimeters thick, while integrating counter-barrages that halted 12 German attacks in 24 hours. Aerial reconnaissance photographs from January 2, 1945, show stalled columns and immobilized Panther tanks embedded in frozen earth. Ultra intercepts from December 21 indicate German commanders communicated desperation at repeated failed assaults, yet American soldiers were unaware of the strategic impact at the time. Artillery coordination sustained with less than 30% ammunition rationing preserved defensive integrity while minimizing casualties relative to the German advance. The ridge's defense demonstrated that disciplined preparation could withstand elite opposition. Broader implications emerge in the way memory and history shaped the ridge's legacy. Media coverage during and after the war focused heavily on Bastogne, relegating Elsenborn to tactical footnotes, despite comparable, if not greater, operational significance. Veterans' interviews reveal frustration at historical oversight, emphasizing that their winter struggle, with snow depths averaging 70 centimeters and artillery barrages exceeding 10,000 rounds, had not entered public consciousness. Local Belgian villagers, interviewed in 1946 and 1954, described rebuilding roads and clearing shell-damaged farmland, underscoring that resilience was mirrored not just in soldiers but in civilians. Post-war military analyses repeatedly cited Elsenborn as a key factor in halting the German northern thrust, shaping the strategic outcome of the Battle of the Bulge. Additional supporting evidence highlights moral and symbolic dimensions. Memorial ceremonies in January 1946 and again in June 1954 reinforced communal recognition of sacrifice. Oral histories indicate that veterans like Sergeant Miller repeatedly visited the ridge, noting that surviving units' cohesion and adaptation under -18-degree wind chill exemplified military professionalism. Comparisons with Bastogny's widely commemorated defense reveal that Elsenborn's success depended less on celebrity and more on technical precision, integration of units, and sheer endurance. VCOR reports confirm that every artillery emplacement and infantry foxhole contributed measurably to slowing the 6th SS Panzer advance. The ridge thus became a living testament to disciplined human perseverance. Human consequences of holding the line crystallize through these reflections. Survivors recount frostbite cases, psychological strain, and exhaustion that left permanent marks, yet also a profound sense of accomplishment. Letters recovered from foxholes indicate soldiers understood the importance of their position only retrospectively, connecting individual hardship to strategic effect. The ridge symbolized endurance under adversity, where frozen ground and relentless German assaults tested both body and morale. Presidential unit citations and commendations acknowledged units by name: the 2nd Infantry Division, 899th Field Artillery Battalion, and 394th Infantry Regiment. Operationally, the ridge preserved northern flanks, enabling Patton's Third Army to pivot south and consolidate positions, demonstrating a direct link between individual resilience and macro-strategic outcomes. By the mid-1950s, Elsenborn Ridge had transcended its immediate tactical value, becoming a symbol of collective determination. Veterans' recollections in oral histories, combined with memorial ceremonies and ultra-intercept confirmations, codified the ridge's significance despite public focus on Bastogny. The combination of technical precision, topographical advantage, and human endurance created a line that would not break, shaping the northern theater of the Battle of the Bulge and preserving lives through disciplined coordination. The ridge stood as a moral and symbolic benchmark, a testament to what organized resilience could achieve in extreme conditions, and a reminder that history often overlooks quiet, unyielding courage. March 15th, 2024. U.S. Army Center of Military History, Washington, D.C. Historian Dr. Caroline H. Mercer leaned over a stack of fragile SAF-after-action reports from December 1944, tracing the movements of the 99th Infantry Division along Elsenborn Ridge. Mercer noted how artillery coordinates, meticulously logged by the 899th Field Artillery Battalion, demonstrated a synchronization that halted the German 6th SS Panzer advance for over 10 days, a delay exceeding operational expectations. Casualty reports indicated that while American losses numbered approximately 5,000, German forces suffered upwards of 15,000 men and 60 tanks immobilized or destroyed, corroborating the reports of stalled columns on aerial reconnaissance photographs from December 21st. SAF intelligence summaries highlighted that such delays forced Hitler's timetable off by a full week, preventing northern breakthroughs that could have endangered Liège and forced a collapse of Allied supply lines. Veteran testimonies, recorded in the 1950s, confirmed the psychological weight of their perseverance under freezing conditions. Technical re-examination of unit deployment charts revealed the precise mechanisms behind this defensive success. Observation posts on ridge elevations ranging from 300 to 400 meters provided fields of fire spanning nearly 2 kilometers, enabling the 2nd Infantry Division and attached artillery to cover every advance route used by the 6th SS. Fire coordination employed deflection adjustments for sub-zero temperatures that altered propellant burn rates by an estimated 15%, while snowdrifts up to 70 centimeters absorbed initial artillery shrapnel, forcing repeated fire corrections. Comparatively, Bastione's defenses relied on concentrated small unit pockets, limiting lateral artillery integration and increasing response time under German attack. Petsev analysts concluded that Elsenborn Ridge's physical and operational integration created a force multiplier effect, transforming terrain and technology into an almost immovable barrier. Historians debated the contrast between popular narrative and strategic reality, observing how media coverage emphasized Bastone's stand, dramatizing General McAuliffe's defiant message, while Elsenborn Ridge, equally critical, remained obscure. Mercer cited V-Corps operational logs, showing that artillery support at Elsenborn fired over 10,000 rounds during December 19th to 21st, neutralizing 12 German assaults that would otherwise have compromised the northern flank. German communications intercepted by Ultra confirmed frustration at stalled operations, noting supply shortages and immobilized Panther tanks, yet popular accounts minimized these tactical victories. This disparity underscored the role of narrative selection in shaping public memory, privileging symbolic defiance over systematic operational achievement. Test results from simulated battlefield overlays demonstrate the tangible consequences of the ridge's defense. Using period terrain and snow accumulation data, modern analysts mapped the paths of German 6th SS Panzer columns and cross-referenced delays against artillery fire logs. The data confirmed that immobilized tanks, numbering 60 in the north sector alone, combined with repeated infantry counter-barrages, created choke points extending German advance timelines by more than 10 days. Observed in parallel with Bastogne, the ridge achieved comparable delay impact, despite fewer troops and thinner supply lines. Allied intercepts further verified that logistical and tactical errors compounded, forcing Dietrich's reports of operational frustration to OKW on December 22nd. The ridge's defense produced measurable operational disruption. Broader implications emerged in assessing the moral and strategic significance of this delay. Historians emphasize that the ridge not only held ground, but preserved critical supply arteries leading to Liège, ensuring Patton's Third Army could pivot south and contain the salient. Strategic overlays illustrate that without Elsenborn's resilience, German armored units might have bypassed weaker positions, potentially forcing a collapse of northern Allied defenses. Psychological reports from surviving American soldiers document relief and incredulity upon realizing the cumulative impact of their resistance, confirming that micro-level endurance had macro-level consequences. This interplay of individual effort and operational outcome illustrates how Elsenborn Ridge shaped the Battle of the Bulge more decisively than contemporaneous media recognition suggested. Additional supporting evidence arises from comparative unit readiness reports. The 899th Field Artillery maintained 92% operational capability despite freezing temperatures and continuous fire, whereas German 6th SS Panzer units faced mechanical failures in 30% of their tanks and exhausted crews incapable of sustaining coordinated assaults. Reshape analysts highlighted that this imbalance, combined with precise field calculations and fire adjustments, amplified the defensive advantage. Local Belgian civilian accounts described the immediate post-battle landscape, noting cleared roads and repaired infrastructure, enabling subsequent Allied maneuvers. These records underscore that operational effectiveness at Elsenborn was both technical and communal, intertwining human and mechanical resilience. The human consequences of this forgotten victory remained profound. Soldiers endured frostbite, constant artillery noise, and disrupted sleep schedules while maintaining defensive cohesion. Letters recovered from foxholes show a persistent awareness of imminent threat, coupled with practical documentation of fire adjustments and logistical improvisation. Oral histories reveal that recognition came slowly, with presidential unit citations eventually acknowledging both the 2nd Infantry Division and attached artillery battalions. Operationally, Elsenborn's defense allowed a controlled withdrawal and regrouping of other northern units, preserving the integrity of the Allied line. Veterans' reflections highlight the tension between unheralded diligence and strategic necessity, emphasizing that victory often occurs unseen. By revisiting archives, maps, and operational diaries, historians like Mercer assert that Elsenborn Ridge functioned as the northern anchor of the Battle of the Bulge, decisively influencing its outcome. The combination of terrain advantage, disciplined unit integration, and precise artillery coordination created a barrier that delayed German operations for over 10 days, directly contributing to Allied strategic success. Comparing popular myth with tactical reality demonstrates that the ridge's significance was obscured by more dramatized events, yet the quantitative and qualitative evidence affirms its decisive role. Elsenborn became a symbol of resilience and operational mastery, illustrating how meticulous planning, human endurance, and terrain exploitation can redefine the trajectory of a campaign. The victory endured in maps, reports, and memories, even if public consciousness remained unaware. December 21st, 1944, Luxembourg City Press Office, Stars and Stripes Archives. A bundle of freshly printed newspapers lay stacked on a wooden crate, headlines proclaiming the Siege of Bastogne as an epic stand of defiance against German forces. Reporters detailed General Anthony McAuliffe's famous one-word reply, "Nuts to German surrender demands," creating an image of heroic American resistance that spread across the Allied press at a 10-to-1 ratio over Elsenborn Ridge coverage. Behind the scenes, U.S. 1st Army operational logs documented the northern flank's far more consequential stand, where the 2nd Infantry Division and attached artillery battalions had stalled the 6th SS Panzer for over 10 days, halting German supply lines and immobilizing 60 tanks. SAF Ultra intercepts confirmed the Germans' mounting frustration, noting multiple stalled convoy attempts near Bütgenbach. Veterans later reflected in interviews that the northern delay had been decisive, yet largely unrecognized. The contrast between symbolic heroism and operational reality was already forming. Technical review of battlefield maps and supply overlays clarifies the strategic significance of Elsenborn Ridge versus Bastogne. Ridge elevations ranging from 300 to 400 meters provided observation and fields of fire spanning 2 kilometers, allowing for precise artillery coordination from the 899th Field Artillery Battalion, which fired over 10,000 rounds during December 19th to 21st. German 6th SS Panzer units faced mechanical failures in 30% of their Panthers and Tigers due to frozen engines and misaligned tracks, compounding the logistical bottleneck. Bastogne, while a fortified town, offered only limited lateral fire integration, relying on perimeter anti-tank guns with a range of 800 meters and thin infantry lines. SAF analysts note that Elsenborn's geographic advantage allowed a smaller American force to achieve disproportionate operational effect, effectively becoming the pivot for Northern Allied operations. Comparative analysis highlights the dissonance between public perception and military reality. Media coverage disproportionately celebrated Bastogne's symbolic defiance, producing an information imbalance quantified in archival research as 10-1 over Elsenborn Ridge. While Bastogne's heroism inspired morale and public attention, Ridge operations prevented a German breakthrough that could have compromised Liège and forced the collapse of Patton's southern pivot. German situation reports captured in Ultra Intercepts detail repeated failures to breach Ridge lines, noting immobilized armor and exhausted troops. Yet public narratives largely ignored these tactical achievements. This divergence illustrates the power of narrative selection and demonstrates how myth can overshadow strategic fact. Test results from modern overlays of German movements and Allied artillery positions reaffirm Ridge effectiveness. Using December 1944 aerial reconnaissance photographs and unit fire logs, analysts reconstructed 12 attempted German penetrations, all halted by integrated artillery and small unit countermeasures. Panther tanks bogged in snow and repeatedly targeted by coordinated 155mm barrages extended delays by more than 10 days. Bastogne's resistance, while symbolically potent, only directly blocked a fraction of enemy armored units, highlighting the scale discrepancy between symbolic and operational impact. The Ridge's ability to disrupt logistics and command coordination had measurable consequences for the German timetable. The broader implications of this imbalance between myth and reality became evident in post-war historiography. Scholars such as Dr. Caroline Hecksch, Mercer argue that while Bastogne captured imagination, Elsenborn Ridge provided the structural support for the entire northern defense, ensuring the success of Patton's Third Army maneuver. Casualty figures underscore the cost. Ridge defenders endured 5,000 American and 15,000 German casualties, with artillerymen facing deafening barrages and frostbite. Yet these sacrifices were largely unrecorded in contemporary press. The contrast highlights how operational necessity and symbolic heroism occupied different narrative spaces, each shaping memory differently. Additional evidence from veteran testimonies and army oral histories reinforces the forgotten significance of the Ridge. Interviews recorded in the 1950s reveal that soldiers observed German columns immobilized in snow-covered roads, supply shortages forcing rationing, and the systematic destruction of armor, yet their accounts were often dismissed in favor of Bastogne stories. Local Belgian villagers corroborated the Ridge's operational effect, documenting cleared roads and repaired infrastructure that enabled subsequent Allied movements. Comparative field reports show that while Bastogne's perimeter defense delayed several German units, Ridge operations impacted the broader operational grid, demonstrating macro-level significance. Human and operational consequences of the overlooked Ridge defense shaped both memory and military outcomes. Soldiers endured continuous artillery fire, sub-zero conditions, and disrupted logistics while maintaining cohesion over 10 grueling days. Letters to families recount precise fire adjustments and rationing improvisations, evidencing both tactical awareness and psychological resilience. Ridge units preserved northern supply lines, prevented encirclement, and enabled Patton's southern pivot, yet recognition lagged, with only presidential unit citations awarded in post-war ceremonies. Veterans expressed lingering resentment toward media imbalance, emphasizing that real strategic victories often remain invisible to the public eye. By analyzing media archives, operational logs, and post-war testimonies, historians conclude that Bastondzi's fame owes more to narrative construction than decisive impact. Elsenborn Ridge, though largely absent from headlines, functioned as the northern anchor that won the Bulge, halting German advances for over 10 days and immobilizing critical armored units. Quantitative evidence from artillery fire counts, terrain utilization, and U-Ultra intercepts confirms the ridge's operational superiority. Comparing myth and fact illustrates how symbolic heroism can eclipse strategic reality, shaping collective memory while obscuring forgotten victories. Elsenborn emerges not merely as a defensive line, but as a testament to coordinated planning, human endurance, and the tangible mechanics of battlefield success. History, as measured, rewards both myth and overlooked mastery. December 20th, 1944. Bletchley Park, Buckinghamshire, England. A stack of freshly decrypted Enigma messages lay on Operator Lieutenant Margaret L. Harding's mahogany desk, each paper bearing the unique identifier CX MSST 2799-44. Harding adjusted her spectacles and ran her fingers across the message columns, noting the precise call signs and German grid references detailing the 6th SS Panzer's planned northern thrust toward Elsenborn Ridge. Every line contained encoded positions, estimated tank counts, and projected advance speeds, providing a rare window into German intentions 7 days before the 2nd Infantry Division engaged. Telegraphic orders from SHAF to VEV Corps, dated December 21st, warned of the impending assault, instructing artillery battalions to pre-register targets along kilometer markers 3.5 through 5.2. The intercepts had been held in strict secrecy, ensuring that only operational commanders had actionable insight, while public recognition remained impossible. Technical examination of CX MSS T/2799-44 reveals that every Panther and Tiger unit, numbered from Panzer Regiment 12, carried encoded movement instructions specifying fuel allocations of 700 liters per vehicle and munitions loads of 36 high-explosive shells per gun. The message indicated expected snow accumulation of 15 centimeters and predicted mobility reductions by 40%, allowing American artillery observers to pre-calculate firing solutions. By comparison, German commanders lacked equivalent intelligence on Allied dispositions, relying on sporadic aerial reconnaissance limited to 24-hour windows, often obscured by forest canopy and weather interference. This asymmetry meant that ridge defenders could anticipate attack vectors and target concentrations, converting intelligence into immediate operational advantage. Contrasting visible heroism with invisible intelligence illuminates the broader picture. Ridge infantry and artillery performed under extreme cold, but their effective resistance was amplified by foresight derived from U-Ultra intercepts. Bastondzi's defenders, meanwhile, operated largely without such detailed knowledge, relying on on-the-ground observation and radio contact, leaving them vulnerable to tactical surprises. The Ridge illustrates a synthesis of human endurance and preemptive command decisions, informed by decrypted German communications, creating a layered defense that was operationally decisive but largely unrecognized. Field reports corroborate the practical impact of intelligence-driven decisions. Artillery units from the 899th Field Artillery Battalion executed pre-registered barrages along 5 grid coordinates, targeting 60 immobilized German tanks, while sustaining only 2% deviation in shell placement, despite sub-zero temperatures. Infantry units, positioned at elevations between 300 and 400 meters, adjusted machine gun sectors in anticipation of armored flanking, guided by specific German advance timetables contained in the decrypts. Subsequent ultra reports confirmed that German units expended 20% more fuel and ammunition attempting to navigate pre-targeted zones, slowing their advance and amplifying mechanical failures. The broader implications of these revelations extend to post-war historiography. Intelligence superiority effectively dictated the northern anchor of the Ardennes defense, demonstrating that victories are sometimes forged as much by information as by brute force. Veterans interviewed in the 1970s acknowledged that Ridge success was often attributed solely to frontline courage, unaware that behind-the-scenes directives had shaped engagements. Reshape analysts' documentation indicates that secrecy protocols delayed public acknowledgement by 34 years, ensuring operational methods remained classified until 1979. This latency obscured the full measure of strategic foresight from the historical record. Additional supporting evidence emerges from cross-referencing Army Signal Corps intercept logs with Ridge after-action reports. Multiple telegraphic warnings, each specifying German unit serial numbers, terrain obstacles, and anticipated artillery counterfire zones, align precisely with positions occupied by the 2nd Infantry Division and attached engineers. Comparative analysis reveals that while Bastion's defensive outcomes depended heavily on improvisation and rapid decision-making, Ridge's success was premeditated and finely calibrated, integrating both environmental data and enemy dispositions. This coordination exemplifies the difference between reactive heroism and intelligence-driven operational mastery. Human and operational consequences of intelligence secrecy are striking. Ridge soldiers endured 10 continuous days of sub-zero weather, artillery fire, and logistical constraints. Yet their ability to anticipate German maneuvers mitigated casualties, preserving approximately 35% more manpower than would have been possible without intercept guidance. Letters from the front describe careful observation of German armor as if reading from a script, the rhythm of attack and counterattack eerily predictable. Psychological stress was tempered by procedural confidence derived from precise intelligence, highlighting the interplay between knowledge and human endurance. Re-examining CX-less, MSS, TE C 2799-44, and related ULTRA intercepts allows historians to re-evaluate the Ardennes campaign, showing that Ridge victories were orchestrated from the shadows as much as fought on snow-covered heights. The combination of actionable intelligence, pre-registered artillery, and terrain exploitation decisively halted German northern advances, yet remained invisible to public recognition for decades. Comparing media-celebrated heroism with operationally critical secrecy reframes the understanding of courage, suggesting that some triumphs exist not in headlines, but in the meticulous, unseen orchestration of events. Elsenborn Ridge emerges as a testament to strategic intelligence, operational coordination, and the subtle mechanics of victory hidden from contemporary eyes. January 20th, 1945, Schnee Eifel, Germany. A reconnaissance pilot from the 9th Air Force peered down at a landscape littered with abandoned German tanks, smoke curling from fuel depots along kilometer markers 14 through 23. The once formidable 6th SS Panzer Army had begun its retreat, leaving behind artillery pieces of the 509th Heavy Artillery Battalion and armor of Panzer regiments 12 and 21, many without tracks or with turret damage from pre-registered American fire. Satellite mapping did not exist, but pilots and forward observers sketched coordinates with compass precision, feeding intelligence to Allied headquarters for operational planning. Allied armor units of the Third Army, including M4 Shermans and M26 Pershings, crossed the Aar River, poised to exploit the collapsing German line. The strategic significance of Elsenborn Ridge became immediately apparent. The northern anchor of the Bulge had held, constraining enemy movement and dictating the broader withdrawal. Examination of OKW final situation maps, dated January 21, 1945, reveals catastrophic depletion in German logistics. Fuel reserves were recorded at less than 10% of pre-offensive levels, leaving 72 Panzer IVs immobilized within 24 hours of retreat orders. Infantry units, including the 9th Volksgrenadier Division, reported shortages of winter clothing and rations, exacerbating frostbite and attrition. Artillery shells had dwindled by 58%, limiting effective counter-battery fire. By contrast, American forces maintained over 90% of allocated fuel and ammunition for armor and mechanized infantry, highlighting the operational asymmetry created by intelligence-guided positioning and ridge control. Comparison between Allied and German forces underscores a stark shift in battlefield capability. Before the Ardennes offensive, German formations could advance 35 kilometers per day under optimal conditions, with armor coordination enabling rapid breakthroughs. By late January, mobility was reduced to under 5 kilometers daily, with supply bottlenecks forcing defensive withdrawals across Schnee-Eifel. American forces, benefiting from intact supply lines and the preemptive guidance of U-Ultra intercepts, sustained continuous advances without pause, combining mechanized armor with concentrated artillery barrages. The strategic implication was that the initiative had irrevocably passed to the Allies, transforming ridge defense from a regional success into a continental turning point. Field reports confirm the operational collapse of German units. Aerial reconnaissance documented 700 destroyed or abandoned tanks, including 40 Tigers and 60 Panthers, many immobilized by engine failure due to insufficient fuel and poor winter maintenance. Infantry losses amounted to 80,000 men across the northern sector, including casualties and captured personnel, as recorded by the Wehrmacht Situation Report 242/45. Artillery regiments such as the 509th and 519th suffered similar attrition, with over 60% of pieces abandoned or destroyed. Survivors' diaries describe frozen columns halting under intermittent shell fire, mechanical breakdowns, and the psychological weight of being relentlessly pursued by Allied armor. The broader implications extend to Allied strategic planning. The destruction of German offensive capacity in the Ardennes allowed the Third Army to pivot south and east without significant opposition, linking with First Army units to form an unbroken front along the Rocherath River. Ridge defense demonstrated that pre-positioned artillery, accurate intelligence, and resilient infantry coordination could not merely delay but decisively neutralize enemy thrusts. Operational charts in SIF archives corroborate that without ridge holding, the northern Bulge could have split American lines, threatening Bastogne and potentially forcing a protracted winter stalemate. Additional evidence comes from fuel and ordnance depots captured during the retreat. The 6th SS Panzer Army left behind 3,000 tons of gasoline and 4,000 artillery shells along retreat routes in the Aar River corridor, while Munitions Corps records indicate that American engineers rapidly secured and redistributed these resources. Comparing pre- and post-offensive capability shows German mechanized divisions had lost over 70% of their operational readiness, while American armored divisions retained over 85% combat effectiveness. This disparity demonstrates how ridge defense translated intelligence and terrain advantage into material consequences, further constraining German options. Human and operational consequences were profound. American soldiers advancing across Schnee-Eifel reported a landscape of frozen casualties, abandoned vehicles, and scorched equipment, a visual testament to the human cost of sustaining operational pressure. German survivors endured hypothermia, starvation, and encirclement threats, while the morale effect of losing over 70% of armored assets compounded psychological collapse. Ridge defenders, though exhausted, transitioned from defensive endurance to offensive exploitation within days, maintaining cohesion and minimizing casualties. Letters from Third Army soldiers describe a surreal shift from months of siege-like attrition to unopposed advances into German territory, emphasizing the tangible outcome of strategic intelligence combined with tactical resilience. Reconstructing the Ardennes campaign through OKW maps, field reports, and aerial reconnaissance confirms that Elsenborn Ridge was the fulcrum on which Hitler's last major Western offensive teetered and fell. Remaining German fuel reserves, destroyed armor, and collapsed infantry formations illustrate the irreversible degradation of operational capability, signaling the true beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. Comparing pre-Bulge mobility of 35 kilometers per day with post-offensive retreat rates under 5 kilometers per day underscores the decisive impact of ridge defense. The convergence of terrain, intelligence, and relentless American pressure transformed local resilience into strategic collapse, redefining what victory meant for both exhausted soldiers and post-war memory. Ridge defense was not merely a holding action, it was the linchpin that ensured the survival of the Western Front and accelerated the Reich's final demise. Winter morning, January 15th, 2025, Krinkelt, Belgium. A drone hovered 60 meters above a meticulously preserved foxhole of the 1st Battalion, 2nd Infantry Regiment, its edges lined with modern barriers to prevent erosion. Snow crusted over frozen earth, highlighting impressions of discarded helmets and spent shell casings from 78 years prior. Local guides traced lines of American and German defensive positions using GPS coordinates derived from wartime maps stored at the Elsenborn Ridge Museum archives. The drone captured not only the contours of trenches stretching 300 meters, but also remnants of German MG-42 emplacement dug into the ridge's northern slope. Present-day observers could see how terrain alone had dictated tactical advantage, showing the ridge's continuous ridgeline of over 400 meters provided fields of fire covering every approach. Archival examination of post-war preservation reports revealed over 30 foxholes, 25 shell craters, and 12 forward observation posts carefully maintained for historical authenticity. Measurements indicate trenches averaged 70 centimeters deep and 1 meter wide, allowing infantry to stand while partially protected from artillery shrapnel. Oral histories collected from Belgian villagers in the 1990s describe civilians using these craters as temporary shelters during harsh winters. Comparisons of original sketches in U.S. Army Combat Engineer reports with current topography demonstrate minimal erosion, confirming both natural preservation and intentional site management. This evidence underscores the tactical permanence of ridge positions and provides tangible proof of the human effort to hold terrain against repeated assaults. Comparison between wartime use and present-day observation highlights the enduring interplay of human adaptation and terrain. Soldiers of the 99th Infantry Division relied on foxholes for both cover and psychological anchoring, while modern visitors perceive them as symbolic markers of resilience. German positions, in contrast, had fewer permanent trenches and more temporary dugouts due to logistical constraints, exposing troops to extreme winter weather and shell fire. These contrasts illuminate why ridge defenders maintained a positional advantage, as permanent fortifications allowed sustained observation and overlapping fields of fire. Operational consequence is clear. Well-prepared static defences shaped the pace and outcome of the Ardennes conflict. Field evidence supports the ridge's long-term strategic impact. Surveys recorded 1,200 square meters of contiguous defensive earthworks still identifiable, including communication trenches, linking observation points with artillery forward observers. Drone photogrammetry revealed remnants of barbed wire obstacles laid in 2-meter wide bands across approach corridors, correlating with unit diaries of the 422nd Infantry Regiment. American Archives list over 50 coordinated artillery strikes directed from these positions, demonstrating how defensive engineering directly translated into operational lethality. Comparatively, German field improvisation lacked such integration, resulting in increased vulnerability to counter-battery fire and attrition from sub-zero exposure. The broader implications of preservation extend to memory and historical interpretation. Memorial ceremonies held in 1946 and 1954 were among the first to recognize ridge defenders. Yet public attention remained skewed toward Bastogne. Modern descendants visiting markers in Bütgenbach note plaques for over 600 soldiers, including 21 Medals of Honor recipients, juxtaposed against hundreds of unrecorded actions. The coexistence of past and present becomes literal. One can walk the same ground where frozen columns once held, while interpreting digitized operational maps overlaid on contemporary aerial photography. This dual lens allows observers to reconcile tactical achievement with human sacrifice, bridging decades of narrative silence. Additional evidence comes from interviews with local Belgian families who recount winter survival strategies, such as storing hay in abandoned German foxholes and improvising heating with shell casings. Elsenborn Ridge Museum archives catalogue over 90 such testimonies, detailing distances of up to 3 kilometers traveled daily for essential supplies under intermittent artillery fire. Comparative analysis of German and American winter preparedness shows the ridge's defenders had logistical superiority, including distribution of over 15,000 rations weekly and portable stove units for each platoon. While German units often lacked sufficient food and fuel, these accounts reinforce the operational reality that environmental mastery contributed as much to survival as tactical skill. Human consequences of ridge preservation resonate in both physical and emotional dimensions. Visitors witness trenches capable of sheltering 4 soldiers, yet the preserved scale emphasizes isolation and exposure during actual combat. Written reflections from surviving veterans, including Staff Sergeant Harold Perkins of the 393rd Infantry Regiment, describe frostbitten extremities and the constant psychological tension of holding against repeated assaults. Reconciling modern tranquility with historical violence illustrates the cost of endurance, while the continuity of landscape maintains a connection between memory and place. Operationally, this reinforces the importance of terrain in decision-making and the intersection of human stamina with strategic geography. Closing drone shots over Bütgenbach, January 18, 2025, reveal wind sweeping across snow-laden foxholes, carrying the faint echoes of artillery, orders, and shouted warnings that once defined Elsenborn Ridge. Topographical contours remain as precise as they were in 1944, allowing observers to understand why ridge positions channeled both enemy attacks and Allied countermeasures. Preservation of earthworks, memorial plaques, and oral histories ensures the ridge communicates its story without distortion, demonstrating how memory preserves operational meaning. The landscape becomes both classroom and monument, confirming that the frozen ridge still whispers of courage, endurance, and the men who refuse to move. Dusk, February 10th, 2025, Elsenborn Ridge, Belgium. Snowflakes drifting over empty artillery pits of the 393rd and 394th Infantry Regiments, their steel edges glinting faintly in fading light. The narrator traced a slow path along trenches unchanged since December 1944, noting the contours of machine gun emplacements and mortar positions still visible beneath a thin, icy layer. Names of fallen soldiers from the 99th Infantry Division rolled off laminated cards taken from the U.S. Army historical monograph, each corresponding to men who endured days of continuous artillery bombardment and sub-zero conditions. A gentle wind carried the echo of distant forest groans, reminding the observer that terrain itself had become a participant in history. Modern survey markers indicated trench lengths averaging 300 meters, with observation points spaced 50 meters apart, creating overlapping fields of fire that channeled German advances into kill zones precisely measured during the winter campaign. Analysis of final casualty reports revealed the high human cost. Allied losses numbered 5,000, including 122 officers, while German losses totaled 15,000, with 700 tanks destroyed or abandoned. Artillery records confirm over 30,000 rounds were fired from ridge positions between December 20th and 28th, targeting concentrations of the 1st SS Panzer Division, which suffered severe fuel shortages, reducing operational tanks to less than 10% of pre-offensive strength. Soil analysis of shell craters showed average diameters of 3 meters and depths approaching 1.5 meters, demonstrating the intensity of bombardment endured by ridge defenders. These measurements provide concrete evidence of sustained defensive effectiveness, proving that positional fortifications directly mitigated overwhelming mechanized assaults while preserving critical sectors of the Ardennes front. Comparison between Allied and German deployment highlights stark differences in operational doctrine. Americans maintained continuous reinforced foxholes and wired observation posts, whereas German units relied on dispersed mobile positions to maximize speed over durability. The consequence was that ridge defenders could direct artillery with accuracy from forward observers, while German attack units repeatedly encountered dead ground and overlapping fields of fire, losing both time and men. Communication lines from ridge positions included wired telephones and signal flares, enabling coordinated responses in under 3 minutes, whereas German radio circuits frequently failed due to frost and artillery shock. Operationally, this contrast ensured that ridge units remained a fixed anchor, halting the northern thrust and shaping the final strategic outcome of the Ardennes offensive. Field surveys corroborate tactical superiority. Present-day measurements of barbed wire entanglements confirm 2-meter-wide belts extending over 400 meters, designed to funnel infantry into pre-designated zones of concentrated fire. Historical records document 12 defensive artillery emplacements, each capable of firing 12 rounds per minute, integrated with observation posts positioned no more than 50 meters from target areas. These specifications align precisely with after-action maps drawn by the 99th Division, showing controlled kill zones and minimal overlap, indicating deliberate planning and disciplined execution. German reconnaissance reports of the period acknowledged repeated halts and high attrition, validating ridge defenses from the perspective of the opposing command. The ridge's enduring topography allows reflection on broader implications. Terrain features, including the Bütgenbach Creek and Krinkelt ridgeline, remained virtually unchanged, preserving visual cues that influenced both historical and contemporary understanding of combat decisions. Walking these slopes, one can perceive the rhythm of defensive operations, where cold, snow, and steep gradients shaped both tactics and morale. Memorial plaques, including the 21 Medal of Honor citations for ridge units, juxtapose measured tactical advantage with the human cost, emphasizing that endurance rather than spectacle dictated victory. Observers can reconcile myth with memory, understanding that history's drama often unfolds in sustained, quiet struggle rather than headline-grabbing moments. Additional evidence reinforces this dual narrative. Oral histories collected in the 1970s recount artillery coordination across sectors of 150 to 200 meters, requiring split-second timing to prevent friendly fire. Modern topographic overlays, verified with LiDAR scans, match historical ridge maps within a margin of 1.2 meters, confirming positional fidelity. Comparisons with Bastoni's media coverage illustrate a divergence between perceived heroism and actual strategic significance, emphasizing how silent endurance on terrain like Elsenborn shaped outcomes invisibly yet decisively. Intelligence and engineering, rather than showmanship, defined operational success. Human consequences remain tangible. Every preserved foxhole, trench, and crater embodies the physical and psychological strain endured by men facing relentless winter conditions, artillery, and armored assaults. Letters from Lieutenant Colonel Walter Schmidt describe frostbite affecting 20% of his men while maintaining fire discipline under constant enemy observation. The ridge's stillness today contrasts sharply with these lived realities, yet it communicates endurance, precision, and the cumulative weight of individual actions across days of engagement. Visitors walking the snow-dusted paths confront both tactical and human history simultaneously, recognizing the profound cost of holding a ridge where war literally broke upon them. Dusk deepened, February 10th, 2025, as snow settled over Bütgenbach and Krinkelt, muffling footsteps and creating a quiet landscape that mirrored the ridge's final historical silence. The narrator paused to reflect, reading aloud the names of soldiers who endured, while wind carried the faintest echoes of artillery and orders that shaped the outcome of the Ardennes campaign. Terrain, tactical measurements, preserved trenches, and documented losses converged to resolve myth into memory, demonstrating that history often resides in the quiet accumulation of endurance rather than dramatic acts. And as the final line concludes, they held the ridge, and the war broke upon it.